What if everything we call love is silently surrounded by shadows we pretend not to see? What if every gesture, every tender memory, every breath of passion is actually part of a labyrinth built long before we realized we were lost inside it? And what if the person we most want to protect is the very one leading us, step by step, to a door that should never be opened? These questions echo like ancient whispers inside walls that have seen too much, as if they revealed a secret that never asked to be known. Some stories begin with an encounter, others with a farewell. This one begins with a feeling, one of those that arrive slowly but cling to the spirit like the cold of dawn clings to the stones of an old abandoned mansion. Love, by itself, is already a territory haunted by possibilities, so beautiful it blinds, so deep it devours. But what if it isn't just love? What if it's a forgotten promise? A destiny refusing to die, a warning we ignored, mistaking it for jealousy, insecurity, exaggeration? What if that silent uneasiness was, in truth, a carefully designed trap? There are places in the world that seem to hold ancient breaths, as if waiting for someone to return one day. And it is to one of those places that memory returns, now a setting where every detail seems trapped in a past that insists on slipping into the present. A house too large to be just a house, a love too intense to be just a love, and a silence too deep to be just silence. That's how the story begins, with a gate slowly opening and the uncomfortable sense that something inside that ancient structure knows exactly who has arrived. With each step, the dust rises as though greeting someone it already knew. Then the air grows heavier, the atmosphere denser, as if each brick of that construction carried memories that were never truly buried. What if none of this is a coincidence? What if every return, every reunion, every touch is part of a script written long before the first tear was ever shed? Now, let yourself be guided. There is a half-open door, and beyond it begins Act 1, where what seems familiar takes on strangely dark contours, and where love blends with the first sign of danger. The story turns to Elias, a man of quiet steps and attentive eyes. Someone who always sought to understand the world through small things. He was used to noticing details other people ignored, the way a curtain moves without wind, the smell of aged wood after rain, the distant echo of laughter that no longer belongs to the present. It was this almost exaggerated sensitivity that once led him to Pedra Alta Manor, a place whose reputation had haunted generations like a forbidden whisper. He never imagined he would return, but this time he wasn't alone. Beside him was Helena, luminous presence, serene in beauty, yet carrying something difficult to define, as though her smile held two stories at once, the one she told and the one she tried to forget. Elias had always found her fascinating, perhaps because of that contrast between delicacy and mystery. It was like watching light pass through an old stained glass window, beautiful, but inevitably distorted. Since they had grown closer, there was something he couldn't name. Not fear, not yet, not distrust, something subtler, like a premonition wrapped in tenderness. Something he insisted on seeing as jealousy, even though he knew it wasn't. They arrived at the mansion on a cloudy afternoon, with the sky watching everything in indifferent gray. The wind blew through twisted trees, producing a sound that resembled distant howls. The facade of the house displayed deep cracks, mapping old wounds across the stone walls. Despite its decaying appearance, the structure had a strange grandeur, as if it still believed it possessed something, even after all this time. Helena looked at the place with a mixture of nostalgia and unease. Her eyes scanned each detail as if searching for a specific memory. Elias noticed the slight tremor in her hands, but she remained steady. That house, somehow, was part of her story. But until then, Elias only knew fragments, disconnected stories Helena rarely shared completely. The interior of the mansion seemed to breathe. When they pushed the front door open, the air that escaped was cold, almost icy, as though it had been trapped for years. The entrance hall was long, with old rugs, furniture covered by linen sheets, and portraits on the walls that seemed to follow the visitors with their eyes. Elias felt a shiver he tried to ignore. After all, it was just a house. That's what he kept repeating to himself. But why, then, did it feel like something inside was waiting for them? As they advanced, the light from outside grew distant, as though the mansion swallowed any intrusive brightness. The smell of mold, old wood, and extinguished candles mingled in a thick perfume loaded with forgotten memories. Elias couldn't shake the sense that each step echoed more than it should, as if the floor had too much depth. Helena led the way with unsettling naturalness. Although she said she remembered little of the house, her posture didn't reflect that. She seemed to know exactly where to go, as if a part of her awakened only inside those walls. The first signs that something was wrong appeared almost imperceptibly. A door that should have creaked opened slowly. opened by itself before Helena touched it. An old portrait showing a woman whose face looked far too much like Helena's, but with eyes darkened by an unnatural shadow. And that faint sound coming from upstairs, something between a sigh and the brushing of fabric. Small things, things that could be ignored, explained away, but together, they created an atmosphere that seeped into the skin. Elias tried to silence his thoughts, tried to convince himself it was all an exaggeration, just anxiety, maybe even jealousy. Jealousy of Helena's past, of stories she avoided telling, of memories that seemed to compete with him in that place. But when Helena stopped at the foot of the main staircase, standing still for long seconds as if listening to something he couldn't hear, Elias knew without admitting it that this wasn't jealousy, it was a warning. The mansion seemed to await that exact moment, and Helena seemed about to reveal something that would change everything. Then Elias heard for the first time the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The sound wasn't loud, but it wasn't timid either. It had the precision of something calculated, as though the house had decided to announce itself. A dry crack, similar to wood snapping under pressure, but there was something beyond that. A low, deep timbre carrying an ancient call. Elias's body reacted before he understood why. His shoulders tensed, his stomach tightened, and his eyes instinctively sought the darkest part of the hallway, where the sound seemed to have emerged. Helena, however, didn't step back. She kept her gaze fixed at the top of the stairs, motionless, as though trying to recognize a forgotten voice. There was something disturbing about the cold serenity she displayed inside the mansion, contrasting with the light and sweet woman Elias knew outside it. It was as if the house brought out another version of her, one too intimate, too deep, as if she had always belonged to the shadows of that place. Elias touched Helena's arm gently, trying to break the silent trance. She blinked slowly, like someone waking from a dream, and finally looked away. "I think the wind hit a beam," she murmured. But her voice held no conviction. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, lined with closed doors and antique furniture covered in thick dust. Time inside the mansion was more than a concept. It was a presence. The walls, marked by wear, seemed to absorb every step, every breath, every thought. Elias had the unsettling feeling that if they stayed long enough, they would start to forget the world outside. As they explored each room, Elias noticed small details that unsettled him further. A picture frame on a side table, covered with a thin layer of dust, showed Helen or someone identical to her in a photograph far too old to be possible. The dress, the hairstyle, the expression, all belonged to a distant era. And yet, the resemblance was alarming. Helena turned away quickly when she noticed the photo, as if the object awakened something she didn't want to touch. A chill ran down Elias's spine. Something was wrong. Something that went beyond coincidence or family resemblance. They moved to the east wing, where long windows displayed landscapes that seemed different with each glance. Shadows, clouds, and light shifting as if painting a scene in constant motion. The garden outside was filled with dry leaves, worn sculptures, and an old fountain whose stagnant water reflected the cloudy sky like a broken mirror. But it was inside the house that Elias felt the greatest weight. A silent presence hidden in cracks, corners, and the thickness of the wood. As if the mansion had a consciousness, a living memory that recognized who arrived, who left, and who dared search too deeply. Helena finally led him to the main hall, a large room with a ceiling so high that shadows clung to it like trapped clouds. A massive stone fireplace stood against the wall, stained with ancient soot, and above it hung a grand portrait. A solitary woman dressed in black stared at the horizon with a firm yet melancholic gaze. Her long hair fell over her shoulders, and in her eyes there was a glow Elias couldn't define, something between profound sorrow and veiled threat. Helena stopped before the portrait, and Elias watched the way she breathed. Something in that painting struck her, and it wasn't nostalgia. An invisible thread connected them, though Elias didn't understand how. "Who is she?" he asked hesitantly. Helena took a few seconds before answering. When she did, her voice was fragile and distant. "My great-grandmother," she said, "or at least, that's what they told me." A cold wave went through Elias's chest. There was something deeply unsettling about that woman in the portrait. A presence that dominated the room, overshadowing the heavy curtains, the worn carpet, the antique furniture. The resemblance to Helena wasn't just physical, it was atmospheric. The same quiet air, the same dark delicacy, the same sense of carrying far too many secrets. Trying to refocus, Elias's eyes fell on an object resting on a side table, an old notebook. The leather cover was worn, the metal clasp bent as if forced open. He ran a hand over it. The material was strangely cold. Helena stared at the notebook, and her expression shifted, recognition mixed with aversion. "You know this?" Elias asked. Helena looked away, breathing deeply. "I don't know if I want to remember," she said, "but I think I do." Elias opened it slowly. The yellowed pages held elegant but shaky handwriting, not typical notes. These were fragments of confessions, thoughts interrupted, like someone writing in haste, desperate to record something important before it was too late. The first lines were harmless, memories of the house, family stories, descriptions of quiet days, but as they read on, the handwriting changed, slanting, irregular, frantic. The sentences grew unsettling. "He is different. There is something in his eyes I no longer recognize. The house watches him. The house wants him. There are nights when I hear footsteps in the hallway, but no one is there. Or maybe someone is. Maybe I shouldn't look. If I disappear, let them know it wasn't my choice. The house holds secrets, and they have awakened." Elias felt his breath catch. He looked at Helena, but she stared into the fireplace, avoiding everything else. The notebook wasn't just a journal. It was a warning written by someone who seemed to have lived exactly what they were beginning to experience. As Elias flipped more pages, the room seemed to shift subtly. An almost electric sensation rippled through the air, as though the house itself reacted, as if the old words were keys unlocking invisible doors. At that moment, the dim yellow lights flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. Helena stepped back. Elias closed the notebook instinctively. The house inhaled. And then something in the depth of the hallway moved. A soft but unmistakable sound, like fingertips sliding along the wall. There was no wind. No open windows. No explanation. And for the first time, Elias was certain they were not alone in the mansion. Something had awakened with them, and it was coming. For an instant, time seemed to split in two inside the mansion. There was the before of that soft sound in the hallway and the after. The before was still a territory where fear could be rationalized, where Elias could convince himself everything was exaggeration. Imagination, nerves, stirred by Helena's memories. The after, however, was something different. The very air felt aware. From that moment on, the idea of being merely inside an old house was no longer enough. The sense of presence grew gradually, like a shadow stretching as the sun dies. It wasn't loud or theatrical, it was discreet, subtle, almost elegant in the way it approached. The soft noise fingers brushing the wall traveled down the corridor, drawing an invisible line connecting the past to the present. Elias felt each heartbeat resonate through the wooden floor. His mind tried to summon logical explanations, an animal trapped inside the walls, old pipes expanding, maybe nothing, but another part of him refused these answers. The intuitive part, the same part that had known all along that his uneasiness was not jealousy. That part recognized something else, a hidden threat unfolding with purpose. Helena, for her part, seemed divided. Her body was rigid, her breathing betrayed unease, yet her eyes carried a strange, almost familiar gleam, as if that environment were at once a source of fear and belonging. It was like watching someone return to a forgotten wing of their own soul, an inner corridor locked away for years. The mansion, with its cold walls and ancient smells, worked like a warped mirror where repressed parts rose to the surface. Within that setting, the relationship between Elias and Helena took on a delicate outline. He loved her with a quiet intensity, the kind that reveals itself more in care than in words. But in that place, this love acquired a particular weight. The feeling, once merely tender and restless, became vulnerable. The house seemed to place itself between them, like a third presence, sentient and jealous, that watched every gesture and every thought, weighing whether it accepted or rejected that bond. Elias had always been a perceptive man, but he had never felt so watched. The sense of being targeted by an invisible gaze grew sharper with every room they explored. It was like walking inside a portrait. The mansion seemed to have memories of its own about people like him, outsiders who drew close to someone who belonged to it. There was a kind of silent resistance, an implicit refusal, as if the structure did not trust his presence there. As the air in the main hall grew thicker, Elias turned his gaze back to the notebook on the table. That object seemed to pulse with meaning, as if it were a conduit between eras. The words written there, steeped in fear and urgency, were not just distant records. They were direct echoes inside the present. That warning about someone who had changed, about the house that watched, about secrets that awakened, sank deep into Elias's mind, forming disturbing connections. He then recalled small moments he had lived with Helena before they ever came to the mansion, times when her gaze would drift away for no apparent reason, as if she were listening to a distant call. At first, Elias had interpreted those instants as distraction, work, worries, fatigue. Later, he began to feel something like jealousy, as though there were a part of her he could not reach, a layer of memories and fears that was not shared with him, that ate at him in silence, like a slow poison, and he tried to push the feeling away, labeling it as insecurity. But there, in front of the great-grandmother's portrait and the old notebook, everything took on a different meaning. Maybe it wasn't another person. Maybe it was another time, another bond, another promise made before they were even born. The flickering light of the old lamps gave the scene an almost ritualistic tone. The sheet-covered furniture, the darkened paintings, the silent fireplace, the dominating portrait, the open notebook, each element seemed to occupy a specific place, as if it were part of a stage set prepared for a reunion. The distant sound in the hallway, now gone, left behind only one impression, that something was evaluating them, deciding whether it was already time to show itself. Elias felt an impulse to leave, to open every window, to let the outside air rush in and tear through the oppressive atmosphere, but at the same time, something held him there. It wasn't just his love for Helena, it was also his fascination with the invisible story unfolding around them. Truth has a magnetism of its own, especially when wrapped in mystery and pain. He needed to understand, he needed to know why that house and that woman seemed to belong to one another. Little by little, Act 1 was revealing itself as a careful preparation. Every hallway walked, every door pushed open, every detail observed, built a subtle mosaic. There was a romantic tone that did not dissolve, even in the face of growing strangeness. On the contrary, the affection between Elias and Helena seemed only to deepen in that dangerous territory, as if the closeness of the abyss awoke a paradoxical desire to cling even tighter to one another. The fear of losing intensified the desire to keep. Elias, however, was beginning to realize that the real rival was not some old lover, someone from Helena's past with whom she might have lived something intense. The real rival was the past itself, the stream of experiences and traumas that echoed through the walls, the objects, the fragmented memories. The mansion placed them before a deeper, stranger kind of jealousy. Jealousy of everything that came before, of everything that had shaped Helena before he ever met her. The silence that settled after the sound in the hallway was not peaceful. It was a loaded silence, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Something was preparing itself. The house seemed to listen to their steps, weigh their thoughts, judge their intentions. And somewhere invisible on the second floor, a decision seemed to be taking shape. Meanwhile, the natural light outside began to change. The cloudy afternoon drifted into a sort of uncertain twilight, when it was no longer truly day, but night had not yet claimed the sky. The gray brightness filtered through the dirty windows and gave the rooms the look of blurred memories. The entire setting seemed to exist outside regular time, as if the mansion had created its own measure of hours. Elias felt the weight of that different time as his thoughts began to slow, as if being dragged inward by the house. He realized he no longer clearly remembered how long they had been inside. Maybe a few hours, maybe more. The notion of the outside world, of routine, of commitments, faded. All that remained were footsteps, echoes, the smell of wood, Helena's presence, the watchful portrait, and the notebook. One detail, however, escaped their attention for a few seconds. On one of the walls in the main hall, slightly offset from the fireplace, there was an old mirror with an ornate frame. The glass, partially clouded with age, reflected imperfectly, distorting images like murky water. At certain angles, it seemed to show not only what stood before it, but also something beyond, as if it allowed a glimpse of another time overlaid onto the present. In that mirror, for a moment too brief to be fully understood, a scene seemed to take shape. Two figures, close together, aligned with the exact spot where Elias and Helena were standing. But the outlines were different, the clothes older, the lighting dimmer, as if another story, lived there long ago, were being superimposed on theirs. A kiss interrupted, a tense embrace, a farewell that never quite happened, all in a single smear of reflection, almost imperceptible. Elias wasn't sure if he had truly seen it, but the slight chill at the back of his neck answered for him. The mansion was slowly ceasing to be merely a setting and becoming a character. And not just any character, but one that carried jealousy, promises, and unresolved deaths. By then, Act 1 was nearing the point where it would stop merely suggesting and begin to escalate. The seeds of doubt were already planted. The notebook of warnings, the portrait that mirrored Helena, the feeling of being watched, the sound in the hallway, the distorted reflection in the mirror. Elias understood, even without saying it out loud, that something was underway, something that preceded their love story and that, in some way, had dragged them there. Even so, he stayed. Because when love runs deep, it often chooses to ignore the instinct for self-preservation. And because his fear of losing Helena was greater than his fear of the unknown surrounding them, the house seemed to recognize that choice. And in silent response, something on the second floor decided it was finally time to make itself heard again. This time it would not be just a discreet sound in the hallway. It would be the first clear sign that this place had plans of its own for their future. And when night finally fell, Pedro Altamana would stop merely watching and begin to act. Night approached Pedro Altamana like someone who knew the path by heart. There was no gentle transition. It was not a gradual, delicate dimming. It felt as though, in one instant, a hint of grey light still filtered through the old windows, and in the next, everything was plunged into dense twilight. The world outside vanished behind a thick veil, leaving the house isolated in its own territory, as if time and space had decided to step back a few paces. Shadows settled into the corners of the rooms with practiced ease. The wood creaked more often, as if shifting its position, adjusting to the weight of awakening memories. The mansion, which had only been watching before, now seemed to realign itself, accommodating the fact that tonight it would have company, and perhaps something more than that. Elias felt the weight of that plunge into darkness. There was a difference between being in an old place by daylight and staying there once the outside world was no longer visible. Daylight left some distance, some sense that one could still leave. Night, on the other hand, drew a closed circle. It gave the impression that any attempt to depart, at that point, would be like trying to escape from inside a thick, clinging dream. Helena walked the corridors with slower steps, as if the house itself modulated her pace. With each movement, she seemed to be crossed by memories that came in silent waves. Small scenes far too old to belong only to her current life rose as fragments. A long dress dragging on the floor, the smell of freshly extinguished candle wax, a distant melody played on a piano that no longer existed there. It was as if her presence worked as a key, releasing certain dormant layers of the house. Their romance wore a strange outline that night. The affection that bound them still existed, but now it seemed covered by a thin film of unease. The love did not vanish, but it was forced to coexist with something that slipped between them. The growing sense that there was a third force in their relationship, a silent entity made of memories, broken promises, and ancient jealousy. The mansion itself appeared to react to their closeness, as if assessing the legitimacy of their bond. They decided to remain on the more central floor of the house, where the main hall, staircase, and some bedrooms were connected by a broad corridor. There was a practical thought behind it. This way, they would have quick access to the exit if something unsettled them too much. But on a deeper, instinctive level, the choice was also influenced by the perception that certain areas of the mansion did not want to be visited that first night, as if the place had wings that would reveal themselves only when it deemed the time right. The hours that followed spread like a dark fabric. Time no longer seemed to obey clocks. It obeyed the rhythm of the house's noises. Small cracks, tentative steps, wooden whispers, the moan of wind seeping through nearly invisible gaps. Amid all this, Elias noticed, now and then, the way Helena would stop and tilt her head slightly, as if listening to something he couldn't hear. There were moments when her eyes filled with an inexplicable longing. A longing perhaps for something that hadn't even been lived by her, but by someone before her, in some kind of cycle determined to repeat itself. The romantic atmosphere blended with this discomfort in a strangely harmonious way. Helena's touch was still gentle. Her presence still brought Elias a deep quiet, a feeling of already belonging. Yet now, this comfort came with a contour of danger, like a beautiful flame leaning too close to ancient fabric. Inside those walls, love felt both like a refuge and a lure. At a certain moment, while they were searching for a less dusty room to rest in, Elias noticed a door he hadn't seen before. It was almost hidden between two large bookcases pressed against the corridor wall. It had no ornamentation, just dark wood and an old lock, with no key in sight. Curiously, unlike the other doors, this one didn't seem to have been touched by time in quite the same way. No clear stains, no deep cracks, just a quiet, guarded integrity. As he looked at the door, Elias felt a weight in his chest, as if the air there was suddenly thicker. He had the clear sense that there was something important behind that threshold, something that might change his understanding of the entire story. At the same time, some part of him knew he should not force his way in that night. The mansion gave the impression that it would tolerate curiosity only up to a point, and would react poorly to any attempt to rush. When Helena noticed Elias's attention fixed on that door, she turned her eyes away quickly. Her posture betrayed something deeper than simple ignorance. It was the reflex of someone who recognizes a forbidden point within a memory, an inner place one does not dare enter, even knowing it exists. This gesture of silent refusal stirred in Elias a mix of hurt and restlessness. The feeling of not belonging to certain chapters of her life intensified, like a jealousy that no longer referred to people, but to secrets. They moved on, searching for a room that offered at least a minimum of comfort. They found a space less swallowed by decay, with an old yet sturdy bed, heavy curtains, and a massive wardrobe against the wall. There was also a small nightstand with a slightly open drawer, as if someone had left it like that the last time they'd been there. The air, though heavy, felt less oppressive than in other rooms. It was there that the feeling of intimacy mingled most intensely with the sense of danger. Elias felt that, in that room, the bond between him and Helena would be closely watched by the house, as if the mansion, steeped in stories of interrupted loves, were about to record yet another chapter in its long chain of encounters and partings. While Helena explored the window, pulling the curtain aside in an attempt to see outside and finding only darkness, Silius approached the nightstand. It seemed ordinary, but the half-open drawer called to him with a quiet insistence. A mix of fear and curiosity welled up in him. In each situation like this, he felt that the house placed him before choices. Either insist on staying at the surface, or accept the invitation to descend one step deeper into the unknown. He pulled the drawer open carefully. Inside he found small personal items forgotten by time: a yellowed handkerchief, a broken ring, a piece of hair, ribbon, a brooch with a dark stone at its center, and beneath it all, hidden as if it did not want to be found easily, a piece of paper folded many times over. The touch of the paper revealed the fragile texture of something very old, edges on the verge of crumbling. When he unfolded it, Elias found handwriting as elegant as the notebooks, but even more irregular, as though written in a moment of great agitation. The lines were fragmented, as if the text had been interrupted multiple times and then resumed in a hurry. The content, however, struck him with the precision of a blade. The message spoke of a repetition. It spoke of men who came to the house, drawn in by a luminous female presence, and who, little by little, were wrapped in the mansion's atmosphere, as if the structure itself were testing them. It spoke of jealousy, not that of a boyfriend, fiancé or husband, but of something larger than any person. The jealousy of the house, which did not easily accept sharing those it considered its own, and it described a disturbing pattern. All those who got too close to the heiress in certain generations ended up finding death within those walls in strange ways, always tied to dark coincidences, improbable accidents, decisions made at the exact moment they should not have been made. In the last lines, almost illegible, there was a sort of conclusion. Someone long ago seemed to have realized that the mansion was not merely the setting of tragedies, but an agent of them. That there was a force awakened there, sustained by years of pain, by promises of protection left unresolved, by lovers who had vowed never to part and had been torn from one another within those very walls. The paper, however, held something even more unsettling. In one passage, it mentioned a male figure described with physical details that Elias slowly recognized. Approximate height, elongated face, a certain introspective expression, the way he carried himself like someone who was always observing everything in silence. It was as if that text, written decades earlier, had portrayed him without using his name, anticipating his arrival as part of a sequence that refused to end. Elias's blood seemed to freeze in his veins. The feeling of being an intruder widened into something more concrete. Perhaps he wasn't just an occasional visitor. Perhaps in some way he had been expected. The realization cut through him with force. What if the love he felt for Helene, so sincere, so real, had been, on some level, guided by something beyond mere coincidence? What if, from the very beginning, there had been an invisible plot steering his steps toward this place, fed by forces unwilling to remain dormant? His mind swung between a desperate attempt to rationalize everything and the growing awareness that this was not a common relationship. The mansion, with its portraits, notebooks, forgotten papers, and watchful corridors, was building a story far larger than two lovers trying to work things out. At some point, love, death, promise, and destiny had intertwined in an unbreakable way. Act 1, quietly, was nearing its limit. The pieces of the setting were already in place. The house that breathes, Helena bound to a lineage marked by loss, Elias fitting disturbingly well into a pattern traced long before. Small signs had accumulated, sounds, reflections, old writings, the door that did not want to be opened, the constant feeling of being watched. Holding the paper in his hands, Elias felt the mansion close in a little tighter around him. It wasn't just a metaphorical impression. The air truly seemed heavier, as if the structure itself had recognized that he now knew too much. At that exact moment, a sharp crack echoed from the hallway. It was not like the diffuse creaks they had heard throughout the day. It was a single, decisive sound, like a cog finally snapping into place. Right after, another noise, something heavy being moved in a nearby room, like a piece of furniture dragged slowly across the floor. There was no wind, no extra people, no plausible explanation. Elias lifted his gaze, the paper trembling between his fingers. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague premonition, it was almost physical. The house seemed to be moving its pieces again, and while it did, Helena, a few steps ahead, leaning against the dark window, seemed to hear a call rising from inside her own mind, an invitation to remember things she had always feared to revisit. In that moment, their romance ceased to be just a story of two hearts trying to find each other. It became part of something bigger. The invisible title of the plot wrote itself over them. It had never been just jealousy. It was the outline of an ancient trap, refined over generations, ready to snap shut on anyone who dared to love within those walls. The sound of the dragged furniture kept echoing in Elise's mind long after it stopped. It was as if the noise had carved an invisible line between that room and some other part of the mansion, marking the beginning of an inevitable path. From then on, everything that could once be interpreted as impression or coincidence began to solidify into something clearer. The atmosphere of mere strangeness was slowly turning into threat. The paper between his fingers seemed to vibrate with a kind of ancient energy, as if it wanted to be read again, understood from different angles. The words that described the repetition of men drawn to that place, the strange accidents, the jealousy of the house itself, gained new weight as the night advanced. They were no longer just distant accounts. They were now foreshadowed reflections of a story that seemed to be beginning again through them. Helena remained by the window, as if trying to see something beyond the darkness outside. Maybe she was searching for some proof that a normal world still existed beyond those walls, a world of streets, people, routine, distant lights. But the mansion seemed to have drawn a veil over all of that. Outside, there was only blackness. Inside, there was too much. The love that bound Elias and Helena now breathed in a different environment. It was no longer just the comfort of being close, the familiarity of gestures, the warmth of a cherished presence. Now, the feeling had to survive inside a field of invisible forces. The house placed itself as a silent intermediary, filtering emotions, amplifying fears, distorting memories. What one felt for the other was real, but the way it was perceived passed, little by little, through the mansion's jealous gaze. The night wore on, and physical exhaustion began to impose itself over the alert mind. At some point, even with restless hearts, their bodies demanded rest. The bedroom became the stage for a restless sleep, the kind that doesn't offer full relief, only brief escapes from wakefulness. The mansion, however, seemed to take advantage of those moments precisely to work in silence. Elias didn't exactly have dreams. He had fragmented visions, as if his mind were tuned to an old frequency. He saw corridors he didn't know, lit by candlelight, dark dresses moving quickly, blurred faces exchanging looks heavy with urgency. In some of these fragments, he felt trapped inside the house itself, calling out to someone and never being heard. There was a suffocating sense of repetition, as if he were reliving something that, at the same time, he had never actually lived. Between one of these visions and the next, one image stood out. A delicate feminine hand held a sealed letter, closed with dark wax. The seal bore a symbol he couldn't fully make out, but it seemed to blend a flower with a stylized eye. The letter was kept in a hidden compartment in the wood of some piece of furniture Elias couldn't immediately identify. The feeling, however, was clear. The letter existed, somewhere concrete inside the mansion, waiting to be found. When he awoke, the room was still wrapped in dimness. The night was not over. The silence of that moment was different from the silence at the beginning of the night. It smelled of tiredness, of something that had already moved a great deal and now only watched, deciding the next step. Helena slept uneasily, her expression tense, as if fighting memories that tried to surface. The vision of the letter remained vivid in Elias's mind. It did not feel like an ordinary dream. It felt more like an instruction. The sense of being guided, step, by some invisible intelligence was growing. And with it grew another doubt. To what extent were his choices really his own? To what extent had his love for Helena been mere encounter, and not a summons? Slowly, as sleep left him completely, one thought began to assert itself. The letter needed to be found. Perhaps it held an explanation. Perhaps it brought a more direct warning. Perhaps it would finally confirm what the paper and the notebook only hinted at. There was a narrative thread stretching from the past into the present, and Elias realized that if he didn't follow it, he would end up swallowed by a plot he only half understood. The house, in its silence, seemed to agree. He left the bedroom carefully, avoiding unnecessary sounds. The hallway was dark, but his eyes were already adjusting to the half-light. The furniture, the picture frames, the closed doors, everything took on ghostly outlines under the faint light seeping from distant cracks. The air carried a mixture of dust, aged wood, and something indefinably nearly imperceptible scent, as if some kind of incense had been burned there for years. The vision of the letter guided him, even without pointing to an exact place. There was, however, an insistent sense that the piece of furniture with the hidden compartment was in a room they had not yet explored properly. Some space between the main floor and the second one, a sort of transitional room, perhaps an office or an old library. At the top of the main staircase, Elias once again felt the presence of Helena's great-grandmother's portrait dominating the wall below. Even from a distance, the figure seemed to watch him. There was an uncomfortable bond between that image and everything happening in the house. It was as if, in some way, that woman's story had not ended in the grave, but had spread through the mansion as a permanent echo. He moved along the side corridor they had not yet walked in full. The doors there were less grand, as if they led to more private rooms. The third door on the right stood out, not because of any visible ornament, but because of the feeling that emanated from it, the same kind of density he had sensed from the door hidden between the bookcases downstairs, but more subtle, as if that room held fragments rather than the core of the secret. When he pushed the door open, he found a space that did, in fact, resemble an old office. There was a sturdy desk, a partially empty bookcase, a worn armchair, heavy curtains covering a window that let almost no outside light in. Loose papers were scattered on the floor, yellowed and brittle. The atmosphere there was one of interrupted confession. The desk drew his attention. That was where the letter in his vision had been kept. The dark wood bore marks of intense use, as if someone had spent many nights leaning over it, writing without rest. On the edges, small scratches suggested restless fingers, hands, seeking support in moments of anguish. Elias ran his hands along the sides of the desktop, inside the drawers, and just beneath the main panel of wood. There was something there, an irregularity in the texture that betrayed a hidden mechanism. With patience, he found a tiny protrusion, almost imperceptible, that gave way under his pressure. A secret compartment opened, revealing exactly what he expected to find: a folded letter, sealed with dark wax. The seal was identical to the one in his vision. The hybrid figure between a flower and a stylized eye seemed to watch him from the past. There was something deeply unsettling about that symbol, as if it condensed the mansion's essence, something that blooms beautiful, yet never stops watching. Elias's hands trembled slightly as he broke the wax. The paper exuded an old scent, but still distinct, as if it had been kept for that specific moment. The text, written in careful handwriting, was not a simple account. It was a kind of confession addressed to someone who was not present at the moment of writing. The letter spoke of a love that refused to accept an ending. It described a promise made within the mansion's walls, a vow to never allow the beloved to be taken away from there against the lover's will. That vow, however, had been formed with words too charged, delivered to ears too many. Perhaps it had not been heard only by the beloved, perhaps the house itself had absorbed it. The letter's author, whose identity was not stated but whose tone revealed an intense bond with the heiress of that time, confessed line after line that something had answered the vow, something subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Small coincidences that prevented trips, visits, moves, accidents dodged, voices in the hallway, doors that locked for no reason. With time, what had seemed like protection began to turn into imprisonment. The letter described a growing fear that the feeling of protection had transformed into something far too possessive, encompassing not just the beloved person, but anyone who dared come near her. The mansion seemed to have taken on the role of guardian of the bond, but with a sickly zeal. Thus the revelation was completed. The jealousy that hovered over that family's stories was not only human, it was almost territorial. The house seemed to have developed the ability to interfere with the fate lines of those who crossed its threshold. In the final passages, the author admitted to a terrible premonition that if the cycle were not broken, other generations would be sucked into the same repetition. Men would arrive, fall in love with the heiress of the time, and slowly be dragged into situations where death became almost inevitable. As if the mansion demanded a price for each promise of love made beneath its roof. As he read, Elias felt the weight of each word on his chest. The letter didn't speak only of a distant past. It spoke of him, of Helena, of what was unfolding at that very moment. Their love, instead of being seen as something new, sweet, and free, began to look like an echo of something already foretold, a continuation of a painful chain. A sharp doubt rose. What if the feeling that had drawn him so strongly to Helena had been, in part, amplified by this silent force that wanted to repeat the story? What if the intensity he had always attributed to chance and romantic destiny was a bond patiently built by a house that refused to accept being forgotten? With each revelation, Pedro Altamana seemed to lift a mirror before him, not just to show the past, but to question the present. The love that drove him was genuine. He knew that at the deepest level of his soul, but he could no longer ignore the feeling that he had been pulled, nudged, subtly guided there. Love, death, promise, memory, and destiny circled around him like flames in a ritual circle. And at the center of that circle stood Helena, the heiress of the moment, immersed in memories she had not yet allowed to fully surface. When he finished reading the letter, Elias noticed a detail he hadn't seen at first. At the bottom, beside an illegible signature, there was a short phrase, almost erased by time but still sharp enough to wound. The phrase stated, simply and definitively, that the house did not forgive those who tried to break the cycle. At the very moment he absorbed those words, a deep sound echoed from downstairs, as if a heavy door had shut on its own, and back in the bedroom, Helen awoke with a start, pulled into reality by a memory so strong that, for the first time, it threatened to fully tear through the veil of oblivion. Helen awoke like someone emerging from underwater, heart racing and breath uneven, her body searching for air as if it had spent too long trapped in an impossible place. Her eyes took a few seconds to recognize the bedroom, the dimness, the heavy curtains, the looming bulk of the old wardrobe. But what brought her back was not the physical setting. It was a memory surfacing with force, as if it had waited for exactly that night to manifest. She remembered being a child in the same mansion, walking through hallways too tall for her small frame, smelling the same wood and dust, feeling the same cold clinging to the walls. She remembered holding the hand of someone older, perhaps a relative, perhaps someone who represented safety at the time. But stronger than that person's presence was another sensation, that of being watched by something without a face, yet with a presence, a kind of silent attention that followed her every step. As a child she had given it an innocent, almost playful name, as if it were the house's invisible friend. Now, as an adult, she understood it had never been playful. The memory returned in small, fragmented scenes. Little Helena playing near the staircase, feeling a shiver for no reason. Someone's voice telling her not to wander too far. An object falling from a high place right after she thought of touching it. The impression that, inside the house, her wishes and fears were amplified. The mansion seemed to have affection for her, a sort of silent preference. Back then, this was mixed with childhood fantasy. Now, under the weight of the revelations Elias was silently uncovering, everything was rearranged. While Helena struggled internally with this memory, still unable to put it into words or organize it logically, Elias, in another room, held the letter that confirmed the existence of a cycle of repetitions, deaths, and distorted promises. They were, in that instant, connected by an invisible thread. The past was finally deciding to surface in both of them, each in their own way. The conflict ceased to be merely external, flowing from the house. It now also lived inside them, inhabiting their minds and hearts. The love between them, though persistent, suffered small tremors the mansion seemed to delight in causing. Elias mentally replayed the sequence of recent events. He recalled the portrait identical to Helena, the notebook filled with desperate warnings, the paper found in the drawer, and now the letter taken from a secret compartment. In each piece, the same message repeated itself. Men came, men fell in love, men were tested by the house, men who, sooner or later, succumbed to inevitable accidents. The more he thought about it, the harder it became to avoid the sense that he was not just the protagonist of his own story, but a variation of something already lived. Within this web of thoughts an emotional shadow grew, not just fear, also a subtle discomfort that touched his pride and vulnerability. Slowly, a painful question emerged. How aware was Helena of all this? To what extent had she brought him there out of pure innocence, and to what extent was there, within her, an unconscious pull to repeat the pattern her family carried? That kind of doubt, fed by the environment, tended to turn into a form of jealousy unlike anything he had ever felt. Not jealousy of another man, but jealousy of the house itself, of her past, of a story he had arrived too late. The mansion seemed to understand this psychological movement with a kind of patient cruelty. Its sounds intensified at the hours when the mind grew more fragile. Objects appeared to shift slightly, just enough to suggest something moving even when no one was near. At times, Elias had the clear impression that doors once only slightly ajar were now half open, offering glimpses of dark rooms, discreet invitations for him to lose himself in ever deeper investigations. When he returned to the hallway after reading the letter to the end, he carried a change inside him that the house seemed to notice. There was in his steps a mix of determination and unease. He was no longer just someone impressed by the place's atmosphere. He was someone who carried dangerous knowledge. And, in places like that, knowing too much rarely went unpunished. The distance between the office and the bedroom felt longer than before. Each stretch of corridor became a tunnel where thoughts echoed too loudly. Elias wondered how far he should go, to what extent digging into the past would actually help save the present. Part of him believed that only by confronting the central secret could he break the cycle and protect Helena. Another part feared that the deeper he went, the more entangled he would become in the plot, until there was no path back. When he stepped back into the bedroom, he found Helena sitting on the edge of the bed, eyes still marked by her jolt awake. She wore the expression of someone who had just revisited a distant and unwanted place inside herself. There were no words at that moment, but none were needed. The tension between them did not come from a lack of affection, but from the excess of unspoken things. The silence that wrapped around them had a texture different from simple absence of sound. It was a saturated silence, in which every gesture, every look, every breath carried the weight of a full sentence. The mansion, witness to that silent meeting, seemed almost to lean in to listen better, even though no voice was used. It was as if the place fed on the accumulated tension, intensifying by its very nature the emotions circulating between them. Helena now carried with her the memory of her childhood in Pedra Alta, and the sense that she had never been entirely alone in that house. There had always been something there, following her steps, keeping her, and watching her. She vaguely remembered being a source of concern among adults, hearing words about the house's influence, about things that repeat if we don't take care. As a child, she hadn't understood. Now, as an adult, remembering this at Ilias's side, everything took on a frightening coherence. At that point, their inner paths began to cross. Even if neither yet had the courage to fully piece everything together aloud, Act 2 gained strength precisely from this overlap of fears and memories, creating a tension the house seemed to orchestrate like an invisible conductor. In a moment of deeper reflection, Elias realized something that hit him with cruel clarity. The mansion seemed to have appropriated the language of love to build its own trap. Attachment, the urge to protect, the desire never to part, all of that had been turned into material for an exaggerated vow, made by someone in the past and absorbed as a silent contract. The house functioned as guardian of that contract, and each new generation seemed called to fulfill it, renewing the pact through stories of intense passion followed by tragic outcomes. Ilias felt that, without noticing, he was walking the same script. The difference was that now he was aware of it. That awareness placed him in a different position from all who had come before, but it also made him the target of greater resistance. The mansion did not seem willing to let someone fully awake simply break the chain. As the inner conflict sharpened, the night deepened. There was no sign of dawn. It was as if the outside world had frozen. Elsewhere, the late night might signal approaching relief, approaching light. In Pedra Alta, however, the small hours took on the contours of a closed chamber, a waiting room before the inevitable. At that hour, the house seemed to be in its purest state, free from distractions, devoted solely to its own games. It was in this context that a new sign appeared. A metallic noise echoed from somewhere distant, as if a very old lock were giving way or being engaged. The sound could not be mistaken for wood, for wind, or for any other natural element. It had the clarity of an intentional gesture. Once again, the mansion did not merely exist, it acted. A shiver ran down Elias' spine as he realized the noise probably came from the direction of the discreet door hidden between the bookcases, the one that had drawn his attention hours earlier and that Helena had avoided looking at for so long. It was as if, after the letter had been read and the memory awakened, the house had finally decided to reveal the next scene. Elsewhere in the house, Helena's memory continued to unfold. She remembered having been forbidden, as a child, to go near certain parts of the mansion, precisely the ones that now seemed to call out to her the strongest. She recalled fragments of hushed conversations about a room that shouldn't be reopened, about things that start again when we disturb what was asleep. At the time, those remarks sounded like adult superstition. Now, however, under the pressure of everything that had surfaced, she realized that prohibition might have been the only real attempt to stop the cycle. The love between her and Elias, at this point in the narrative, reached a paradoxical place. On the one hand, it was the reason all of this was happening. Without their bond, perhaps the house would have remained asleep, only letting dust settle over its portraits. On the other hand, it was also the only force with any chance of facing what was rising against them. Their sincere feeling, despite being contaminated by the environment, still carried a spark of freedom, a capacity to choose differently from what had been chosen before. The mansion, however, seemed to know that, and precisely because of that, it strengthened its attack at their most vulnerable points: insecurity, fear of loss, jealousy. Elias, upon recognizing the pattern described in the letter, began to question, if only silently, whether he was destined to be just another piece on an ancient board someone used to reaffirm the house's power, and then discarded in a conveniently tragic accident. Helena, in turn, struggled against the feeling that she might unknowingly carry a cursed inheritance, a predisposition to drag those she loved into a web of forces she could not control. The turning point was approaching. Everything indicated that the next choice, the next step, would carry disproportionate weight. Stay in the bedroom and pretend nothing would happen, or follow the house's call, walking the corridors toward the door that now seemed unlocked, ignore the signs, or face them, protect their own hearts, or risk everything in the name of a love that might have been summoned to break, not feed, the old pact. The answer wasn't entirely clear to either of them, but Pedralta Manor, with its shadowed hallways and secrets arranged like game pieces, had already made its decision. The metallic sound echoed again, this time followed by the slow creak of a door opening somewhere in the structure. The air changed, as if a new current of memories had been released from a room long sealed. At that exact moment, without planning it, Elias and Helena felt the same impulse to stand up, leave the bedroom, and follow the invisible trail the house now offered them. The decision to leave the bedroom was not communicated through words. It was born from a synchronized, silent, almost instinctive impulse. It was as if something greater than both of them had called out at the same time, a command whispered from the depths of the house, awakening the same urgency in each. Helena rose slowly, still under the influence of fragmented memories forcing their way up, while Elias held the folded letter, now as light as it was dangerous, as if it carried within it an echo of the future. The hallway outside the bedroom looked like a long dark tunnel, a passageway between different lines of time. The air was colder there, as if the house breathed through its cracks, exhaling an ancient breath steeped in stories that had never been fully told. Shadows gathered as though waiting, patiently, for someone to finally cross that threshold. As they walked side by side, Elias realized the mansion's behavior had changed. It was no longer merely observing, it was guiding. The creak of the floorboards, once random and scattered, now always seemed to come from a few steps ahead, as if the house were leading the way, slowly opening the path to that forbidden point. The air vibrated with an energy that could not be blamed on wind or weather. It was something internal, alive, pulsing as if the very heart of the structure were racing. Helena walked with her eyes slightly lifted, as if trying to find on the ceiling answers she could not voice. With each step, she relived something from her childhood, fragments coming in sudden flashes. She remembered hearing conversations about a door that had to remain closed at any cost, about echoes that must not be awakened, about promises that, once broken, demand reparation. The most unsettling part was that some of these warnings did not seem to come only from responsible or superstitious adults. They also seemed to come from voices she didn't recognize. Voices that, at the time, she had attributed to childish imagination, but that now, with memories stirring back to life, sounded terrifyingly real. Perhaps they weren't human voices. Perhaps they were whispers from the house itself, trying, at some distant moment, either to warn or to punish. The wood beneath their feet seemed to change temperature as they advanced. It wasn't warmed, it was a dense, thick sensation, like cold electricity. Elias struggled to maintain emotional control. The letter he had read now acted as a prism through which he interpreted every new event. The words about repetition, about men drawn their precedents shaped by the house, blended with every echo in the corridor. It was impossible to avoid the conclusion that, if they weren't careful, they would become exactly what they feared, part of the pattern. The hallway seemed to narrow until they reached a point where the darkness became almost solid. But in the depths, there it was, again, that soft metallic sound, a gentle click, like a lock finally released after years of silence. There was no doubt. It came from the hidden door between the bookcases downstairs, the door that did not seem to belong to the mansion's regular structure, the door Helena had refused to look at. They descended the stairs slowly, each step groaning like a warning. The great-grandmother's portrait watched everything, motionless yet disturbingly present, its force seeming to grow stronger at night. The deep eyes of the painted figure appeared to know exactly what was about to happen. It was as if, in some way, she had witnessed that moment countless times over the decades, watching each cycle without ever intervening. When they reached the main hall, the change in the air was noticeable. The house was quieter than before, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a tense silence, as if everything were on hold. The walls, the sheet-covered furniture, the dark paintings, every suspended particle of dust. Everything seemed to listen, everything seemed to wait for their next move. The door hidden between the bookcases was slightly ajar, not much, just enough to reveal a dark slit, like a half-closed eye choosing to watch without fully revealing what it concealed. The position of the door was unsettling because Elias was certain that, when he first saw it, it had been completely shut. That minimal opening was a provocation, almost an invitation. Helena stopped a few steps back, as if her body remembered, before her conscious mind, the danger contained in that room. The smell coming from the gap was unlike anything in the rest of the house. It was colder, more suffocated, like the air of a subterranean chamber long sealed. It felt as though that room had remained closed, not from neglect, but from necessity. Elias stepped forward, driven by a mix of determination and dread. He knew the letter had mentioned, among other things, specific areas of the mansion where the cycle seemed to be reinforced, where promises of love made in bygone eras still echoed like a spell without a clear addressee. The hidden door was clearly one of these points, a kind of memory chamber. He noticed something curious as he drew closer. The temperature dropped noticeably. It wasn't just cold, it was an absence of life, an absence of breath. The silence there was heavier, as if no sound dared survive for long in that space. Even the dust seemed to rest differently, as though, beyond that gap, time itself followed a different logic. Helena approached slowly, battling the wave of revulsion and longing the place stirred in her. Proximity to the door seemed to revive erased memories, but not in the usual form of scenes. It came as an emotional flood, fear, sadness, a strange kind of expectation. As if part of her had once lived something there, even if she couldn't remember it clearly. The emotional bond between her and Elias wavered at that instant. He watched her with growing concern, partly out of a need to protect her, partly out of fear that her past, still incomprehensible to him, would prove so strong it might pull her back into something dangerous. Helena, on the other hand, felt guilt for knowing, instinctively, that the house knew her far better than it knew Elias, guilt for sensing that he had been pulled into a plot that wasn't originally his. The tension between them grew, not because they doubted their love, but because that love was now crossed by a force too old to ignore. The moment of opening the door, though not discussed, was inevitable. Ilias's hands reached for the dark wood and, upon touching it, felt something that should not have been possible. The surface, so old, seemed to vibrate faintly under his fingers, as if it were alive, as if the door were preparing to yield not to physical force, but to recognition, a kind of acceptance. The house had decided it was time to reveal. With a slow movement, the door opened a few more centimeters, creaking in a way that sounded less like resistance and more like a greeting, a sigh, a sort of twisted welcome. The darkness beyond the threshold was deep, opaque, as if it absorbed light. Elias felt a chill up his spine, and Helena, at his side, felt a weight in her chest, the sense of standing before something she had always feared, even without knowing why. The room revealed beyond was wide, though they could only see part of it at first. The floor previously seemed to shift into something else just past the doorway, smooth cold stone, like the floor of old ceremonial halls. The smell was peculiar, a mix of damp, old iron and something indefinable that resembled extinguished candles, but denser, as if hundreds of memories had been burned there. The faint light from the hallway barely penetrated the interior. Even so, it was possible to see that the walls were covered in something like ancient tapestries, faded by time yet still imposing. Each one appeared to depict scenes difficult to interpret, silhouettes of people, spiral symbols, figures that could be read as either embraces or imprisonments. The ambiguity of the images gave the room an indecipherable atmosphere, as if it was simultaneously a sanctuary and a cell. In the center of the space, something immediately caught Ilias's eye, a kind of pedestal or low altar made of dark stone, upon which rested an object wrapped in an old cloth. The form beneath the fabric was elongated, slightly curved, hard to make out at first glance, but there was an energy emanating from it, a silent weight, as if this were the core of everything happening in the mansion. Helena took an involuntary step back. Her heart seemed to recognize it in a way her mind couldn't yet explain. Something about that object felt bound to her family's past, to her ancestors' fate, two stories no one had ever had the courage to tell her. The fear running through her body was not merely rational, it was ancestral. Elias sensed he stood before the center of the secret. Something in him whispered that this object, this room, this hidden door were fundamental pieces of the trap that had repeated itself over generations. And, more disturbing still, he felt that the love between him and Helena was already invisibly tied to all of it. The mansion would remain inert for only a few more moments. Because now that they had crossed the forbidden threshold, the next move was inevitable. The darkness behind them seemed to close in slightly. and on the pedestal, beneath the cloth, something shifted just barely, almost an illusion, but enough for Elias to realize they were not simply uncovering a secret, they were awakening something, and whatever it was, had already begun to respond. For a few seconds, no one moved. The pedestal at the center of the room seemed to breathe along with the mansion. The surrounding darkness worked like a frame, isolating that small stone altar as the core of a secret that had taken years to ripen. The old cloth covering the object had an indistinct color, somewhere between gray and wine darkened by time, and it exuded a faint smell of dust, old wax, and something reminiscent of iron. What emanated from it was not just age, but use. It had not simply been stored, it had been reserved. Elias felt the pressure of that center as if he stood before a heart that had been beating for generations, fed by promises, tears, fears, and unresolved desires. Every detail in the space seemed to converge toward that point: the faded tapestries, the symbols on the walls, the circular shape of the room, even the altered floor, now cold stone. Everything suggested this was not just a forgotten chamber, but a place of decision. Helena, meanwhile, experienced something even more disturbing. One part of her reacted to that altar with natural strangeness, as anyone would before something so obscure. Another part, however, carried a silent, almost intimate recognition so deep it hurt. It was like rediscovering a place from her own childhood that had been wiped from memory but not from her body. At some point in the past, she had been there, perhaps in thought, perhaps watching from afar while adults debated whether that room should remain locked. Her chest felt heavy, as if it bore not only her own fear but the fear of other women, other heiresses who had stood in that same position before her. The mansion seemed to have waited for this moment with the patience of centuries. The opening of the door, the sound of approaching steps, the nearness of the altar, it all felt like the sequence of a ritual that only needed to be reenacted with new protagonists. The romance between Elias and Helena, though unique in its pains and tenderness, now became part of a continuous line. Behind them, it was possible to imagine the shadows of other couples, other gazers, other trembling hands before the same pedestal. The fabric over the object did not flutter with the air. It lay heavy, clinging to the shape it covered, as if over the years it had fused with whatever it protected. Even so, Elias felt they could no longer simply turn back and close the door. A point of no return had already been crossed the moment he read the letter, and Helena's childhood memories were stirred awake. Ignoring the truth now would be a silent surrender to repetition. Facing it, on the other hand, meant risking confirmation of the worst. Either way, their love would be tested. He approached the pedestal with slow steps, like someone entering a temple without knowing to whom its worship was devoted. The cold of the stone rose through his feet and legs, as if the structure itself were drawing the warmth from his body. The air there felt thicker, and each breath demanded more effort. Helena remained a few meters away, watching, her heart torn between the urge to stop him and the urge to follow this movement through to the end. Elias lifted his hands and touched the cloth. The sensation surprised him. He had expected something rough, stiff, brittle. Instead, he found a surprisingly pliable texture, almost soft, though cold. It was like touching the surface of something that had been warmed by human hands many times, even if long ago. The house seemed to peer closely at this gesture. The walls, the tapestries, the stone floor, everything seemed to await the instant the cloth would be moved. Carefully, he pulled back the edge of the fabric, revealing the object underneath. What appeared before him had the weight of a painful yet strangely beautiful revelation. At the center of the pedestal lay a book. Not a common book, however. Its darkened leather cover bore delicate embossing made of repeating symbols, circular shapes, interlaced lines, figures that looked at once like branches and chains. At the center was the same symbol from the wax-sealed letter, that blend of flower and eye, something that united beauty and vigilance in a single design. The book was not especially large or imposing in size. Its force lay in the sensation it radiated, something concentrated and intense, like a small core of psychological gravity. Helena shuddered at the sight of it. Something in the texture of the cover, the form of the embossing, the central symbol, stirred in her blurred memories of having once seen a similar image as a child, perhaps in someone else's hands, perhaps lying on a table, perhaps at the center of a tense discussion she had watched hiding in a corner. The memory did not come as a clear scene, but as an emotional blow, a mix of fascination and dread. Elias ran his hand over the cover, and the feeling of contact with something alive grew stronger. It wasn't that the book moved, but there was a subtle vibration, as if the pages held trapped voices, stories waiting for a specific reader. Every fiber of his being seemed to know that if he opened it, there would be no going back. The past, until then revealed only in fragments, would take on a distinct form. The house, which had worked up to that point only in shadow, would show its clearest face. His love for Helena then presented itself in the form of a question. Did he want to protect her from this truth or walk with her straight into the center of the labyrinth, no matter the cost? Did he want to keep her away from this legacy or understand everything, even knowing it might cost them both? The answer was not simple, but there was something in the way she looked at him caught between fear, trust, and guilt that made it clear running away was no longer a real option. He opened the book, character consistency reference. The pages, though ancient, did not crumble. They were thick, resilient, marked with dark ink that time had not devoured. The first leaves did not contain continuous texts, but symbols, as if they were records of a ritual. Drawings of intertwined hands, concentric circles, stylized representations of the mansion with its windows turned into eyes. More than words, those images seemed to narrate an intention. As he went deeper, the content began to arrange itself in sentences. The book seemed to be a mix of diary, manual, and record. In some passages, it described the bond between Helena's family and Pedro Alta Manor, not as mere ownership but as symbiosis. The house was portrayed as an emotional organism, fed by memories, promises, and emotional ties. In other sections, the book described an original vow made many generations ago. This vow had been born from the fear of loss. A man, gripped by terror at the thought of the woman he loved being taken away, had made there, before that very altar, a plea that blended supplication, defiance, and threat. He wished that nothing, ever, could separate them, that any force that tried to intervene would be blocked, that the house itself would become the guardian of their love, repelling intruders, accidents, choices that might lead to rupture. The problem lay in the way the vow had been constructed. The words, recorded in the book, carried a jealousy so intense it bordered on violence. The house, described as sensitive to extreme emotions, had absorbed that vow as a commandment. From then on, any love formed under that roof would be subject to the filter of that original promise. The book then described the beginning of the pattern: intense loves, rapid passions, deep bonds arising with a force that felt almost external, as if summoned, and the emergence of obstacles foreign to the lover's will. Sudden illness, improbable accidents, decisions made under the pressure of fears that seemed artificially magnified. A sort of test, a siege. At a certain point, the book mentioned that, to maintain the pact, the house demanded, from time to time, a definitive proof that love was stronger than fear. In practice, this proof became a trap. Each heiress of the house, when deeply involved with someone, ended up placing that person at the center of a circle of risks. If the bonds survived the pressure, the house would quiet down for a while. If not, the break would come wrapped in tragedy. Helena felt the book speaking directly to her, even without saying her name. The word heiress repeated several times, describing a female figure who, in each generation, became the cycle's focus. The heiress was at once protected and imprisoned. The person beside her was at once companion and target. Elias, reading this, felt something inside him split in two directions. One part filled with compassion for Helena, realizing she had been born into a line marked by something she had never chosen. Another part, however, felt a sharp pain, almost resentment, upon realizing that, without knowing it, he had been drawn there as a piece in a mechanism never designed by him. Jealousy now took on a new shape, more complex and darker. It was no longer jealousy of Helena's past loves or of stories she had lived without him. It was jealousy of the house itself, of that oath capable of shaping fate, of that invisible bond he could never compete with. How does one compete with walls that hold memories? With a ceiling that listens, with a floor that has already watched love's collapse? As they turned to pages, names began to appear. Names of couples, dates, brief notes about what had happened to each. Beside some of them, small marks like symbols of interruption, rupture, death. Beside others, a few lines suggesting they had resisted but at a high cost: insanity or isolation. There was, however, a blank space in the last pages, a section still unfilled, reserved, as if it were waiting for a new story to be written. In that silent gap, the book seemed to reflect exactly the moment in which Elias and Helena now stood, on the edge of a decision that would define whether their names would be added to that list as one more interrupted cycle or as a definitive break in the chain. The room, the altar, the book, everything conspired to push them to the edge of that precipice. The love between them was real, but it was now surrounded by an old structure that watched it with very attentive eyes, ready to claim what it considered its own. And while the words still burned in their minds, a detail they had both overlooked revealed itself. In the lower corner of the blank page, almost imperceptible, a thin line had begun to form, as if invisible ink were slowly becoming visible. It was not yet a complete name, but it was the promise of one, and the feeling that spread through Elias's body was that, if nothing was done, that blank space would soon be filled with his name, with hers, or with both. The appearance of that faint line at the corner of the blank page was almost imperceptible, but it carried such intense symbolic weight that Elias felt his whole body go rigid. It wasn't human handwriting, wasn't spontaneous penmanship. It was as if the book, reanimated by their presence, had begun to write the continuation of the cycle all by itself, patiently waiting to complete what had been set in motion. The ink emerged slowly, like a root breaking through the soil, hinting at a name before anyone could speak it. Helena stepped back involuntarily. Her chest felt as though it had sunk under the weight of it. The idea that their story was being written by an external force born from the house, from ancient vows, from the memories of ancestors brought a kind of terror that had no scream, only silence. For the first time, she clearly felt that something was trying to hijack not only their future, but the very essence of the feelings she carried. Elias shut the book with a quick, almost aggressive motion, as if he could stop the narrative from continuing. The sound of it closing echoed through the room like the slam of a heavy door, leaving a physical impact hanging in the air. The mansion did not respond immediately, but the silence that followed carried a subtle offense. It was the kind of silence that comes before an adjustment, a calculated reaction. Inside him, a storm was forming, not just fear or revolt. He could feel the weight of the trap, feel the past trying to mold him, forcing him into the same structure that had destroyed so many before him. Elias had never been someone ruled by irrational impulses, but there in that room facing a book that wrote other people's lives, he discovered a rare force in himself, a sort of visceral resistance, a refusal to be just another piece on the board. Helena sat down on the stone floor, as if her body could no longer bear the truth standing up. The book, the altar, the secret door, the memory of childhood, the awakening of the cycle, everything stacked on top of her like dense layers of a dark legacy she had never asked to carry. The mansion seemed to have chosen her bloodline as both guardian and victim, as if every woman born into that family had a double role, to preserve the house and be imprisoned by it. Elias knelt beside her, without touching her yet. Their silence was not distance, but a shared effort to understand how to stay together without letting the house define the shape of their love. Jealousy, once just a quiet discomfort, now had a clear form. It was the jealousy of the mansion itself, an entity that refused to share what it considered its own. There was no human rival. The rival was the past, the pact, the very building that surrounded them. Slowly, Helena lifted her eyes. Her gaze was distant, but it carried something new, recognition, a kind of understanding that came from very deep inside. She could finally piece together parts of her fragmented memories. She remembered now, more clearly, seeing adults in the family arguing harshly about the book when she was very young. She remembered hearing the expressions, the price of protection, and the house decides. She even remembered being forbidden from going down the stairs one particular night because you don't play with whoever sleeps in the basement. Back then, she'd thought they were talking about animals, servants, something ordinary. Now, she understood. The basement or that room had never been anyone's bedroom. Something slept there, something emotional, perhaps spiritual, perhaps psychological, something that slowly awakened whenever the heiress of the next generation began to feel true love for someone. The mansion, in some way, seemed to measure, test, observe, drawing nearer as the bond grew stronger. That realization made her shudder. The very love she'd always longed for, the sincere, safe love she'd found in Elia, seemed to have been centered by the house like a beacon. It was no coincidence old memories were returning now. No coincidence sounds, objects, and images were manifesting. The house was reacting exactly as it had in previous generations, as if it had no preference for any one person, but always chose the same script. Elias took a deep breath, trying to order his thoughts. The sensation of predestination gnawed at him. He remembered how he'd met Helena, how the feeling had grown so quickly and intensely, as if driven by something greater. Questioning that hurt. He didn't want to believe his love had been manipulated by a living territorial structure. But even that possibility didn't lessen what he felt. It only made everything more urgent. The emotional tension became almost physical. The pounding of both their hearts could be felt not out of panic, but out of mutual awareness of their situation. They weren't just vulnerable to the house, they were vulnerable to each other, and that vulnerability could be weapon or salvation. The mansion seemed to sense this shift in the air. A soft sound rippled beneath the wall hangings, as if something was scratching or sliding behind them, moving in the dark. The air grew heavier. The shadows cast by the tapestries seemed to stretch, sliding across the stone in directions that didn't match the available light. The place began to react more concretely, like a massive body waking up, flexing its muscles and adjusting its stance. Helena finally stood, still trembling but steady. She walked up to the pedestal and set her hand on the closed book. The gesture was not curiosity, but a silent claim, as if she recognized that part of her fate lay there and, somehow, needed to face it. Elias watched. Anxious in her posture, he saw a strength he'd always admired, but also the risk that the very legacy that had consumed other women before her might swallow her whole. The house reacted differently to her touch than it had to his. The air seemed to withdraw, as if something had sucked the energy out of the room for a second. The tapestries trembled ever so slightly, though there was no wind. A deep sound, almost a murmur, ran through the stone floor. The room seemed to recognize Helena not as an intruder, but as something that belonged there, which was both a relief and a danger. The tension between them reached a point where staying there without choosing a course of action became impossible. It was as though the altar itself demanded an answer: continue investigating or turn back. Face the past or close the door and try to escape before dawn if dawn still existed beyond those walls. Elias looked around and noticed something he hadn't clearly seen before. Though the door was open, the entire room gave the impression of closing in around them. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally, psychologically. It felt as though the longer they stayed in that space, the more the house held them there, as if preparing the scene for a final choice. On the pedestal, a small crack appeared in the stone beside the book. A faint sound, almost like ice fracturing. The house was reacting to the simple fact that Helena had touched the book, and Elias had snapped it shut. It was an answer to a conflict between two forces: their love, which might break the cycle, and the mansion's possessiveness, which wanted to keep it intact. The crack widened slowly, as a silent warning. The mansion would not let that moment pass without demanding something in return. And then, at the edge of the room's darkness, something moved. Not a common shadow, not a play of light, but a discrete figure. Motionless for far too long, that finally began to take shape. It did not yet come closer, did not reveal its face, but it existed, and its mere existence was threat enough. The cycle was now officially awake, and whatever stood there at the back of the room, watching, seemed prepared to test how far Elias and Helena were willing to go to stay together. The figure emerging from the darkness did not advance, did not make any striking sound, did not fully reveal itself. It was silent, discreet, an almost motionless shadow that seemed to exist only on the border between real and imagined. Yet, in that charged atmosphere, it was impossible to mistake it for a trick of light. The simple fact that it occupied a spot that had previously been empty already altered the room's emotional structure. The chamber, which had only watched until then, now seemed about to intervene. Elias felt the presence like a weight pressing against his back. Even though the figure stood on the other side of the altar, it wasn't a presence radiating overt evil, but something deeper and more ambiguous, like an old idea that refused to disappear. The sensation seeping into his mind was that this shadow represented the accumulation of all the broken loves, all the broken promises, all the deaths the mansion had witnessed. It wasn't an individual ghost, but a collective echo. Helena, on the other hand, seemed to recognize that presence in a way she couldn't explain. Her body stiffened suddenly, as if she were facing something both familiar and terrifying. It wasn't visual memory, it was emotional memory, fragments growing stronger as the figure outlined itself in the dimness. It was as if part of that shadow belonged to her story or to the story of the women who came before her. The tapestries still quivered at almost imperceptible intervals, as if the room were breathing with them. The crack in the pedestal widened another millimeter, releasing a dry snap, like a warning that their time to ignore what was happening was running out. Each second inside that room seemed to intensify the link between past and present, between inheritance and choice. Though gripped by fear, Elias also felt a kind of silent indignation. The idea that this shadow and the house itself were trying to define his future with Helena stirred in him a rebellious impulse the mansion seemed to struggle to absorb. It was like an unexpected spark inside the ritual, something that didn't quite fit the old logic of the place. That resistance did not go unnoticed. The mansion responded not with obvious movement, but with an abrupt shift in the air. The room's coldness gave way to a dense, suffocating pressure that gathered near the ceiling and then sank in nearly tangible waves. It was as though the house were trying to smother the emotional rebellion, reminding them that no matter how they fought, they were still inside its walls, under its rules. Helena placed her hand on the altar again, as if seeking a point of support to keep herself from collapsing emotionally. Her touch stirred a stronger vibration this time. The book, even closed, seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. The symbol on the cover, the flower, emitted something like a heat shimmer, even though there was no light. At that moment, the figure in the darkness moved, almost imperceptibly. It did not come closer, it only shifted its stance. And that small adjustment was enough to make the room seem to contract. Elias recognized in that tiny motion something akin to attention. The shadow was observing them, not as a predator, but as a judge. Evaluating, measuring, waiting. The entire story, the whole chain of discoveries, began to converge on the same point. The cycle needed something. It needed to be completed, renewed, broken, or redirected. And Elias and Helena stood at the center of the equation. Two essential pieces positioned on an old board, poised for decisive moves. The fear Elias felt then was different from his earlier fears. It was no longer simply fear of the unknown, of old stories, or of the grim fate recorded in the book. It was more intimate, the fear of losing Helen not to another person, but to a force that claimed in her something he could never match. The house did not need to seduce her, did not need to deceive her. It only needed to remind them that was worse. Helena, in turn, struggled under the weight of the legacy she was finally beginning to understand. It wasn't only the repetition of family tragedies, it was a symbiosis. The mansion had, in a way, been built out of feelings. Each generation added something, a promise, a fear, a broken love. Pedro Alta seemed to breathe human emotion, and she was, by birth, one of the main sources of that energy. Her eyes were fixed on the distant shadow. That silent figure seemed to carry echoes of all those who had passed, their fathers, grandfathers, great-grandmothers, among those layers. Perhaps the original figure of the one who had made the first vow that started the cycle. The mansion, with its diffuse consciousness, might have an essence, an entity that was not human but made of fragments of many humans. The observing presence made no sound, but slowly an atmosphere of expectation began to form, humid, oppressive, persistent. It was as if the room awaited an answer from them, perhaps a gesture, perhaps a decision, perhaps a sacrifice. And the shadow seemed to be the intermediary of Pedro Alta's will. The tension between Elias and Helena reached a level that could no longer be contained. It was as if they stood at an emotional crossroads. Either they would draw closer in a way that could shatter the house's influence, or they would be torn apart by forces that had been at work long before they were born. The book on the pedestal opened by itself, not violently, but with calculated smoothness. The cover rose a few millimeters, slowly, like the breath of someone waking from sleep. The pages turned of their own accord until they stopped precisely on the sheet where the faint line had first begun to appear. Now, however, there was more than one line. A second stroke had begun to form. The ink, emerging from nowhere, traced not a full name, but the first contours of two letters. As if the house were stating, the cycle was already underway, and their story would be written there whether they liked it or not. Helena raised a hand to her mouth, overcome by a terror she couldn't hide. Elias felt his whole body hum with the urgency of stopping that writing. He stepped forward and laid his hand over the page, trying to interrupt the process, but the book shook beneath his touch. It wasn't a weak tremor, it was like touching the surface of something alive that rejected being restrained. The floor shuddered slightly. A wave of energy swept through the room, climbing the walls like heat, falling back like cold. The shadow at the back took a step, just one, but that single step had the emotional impact of thunder. Deep, inevitable, undeniable. The mansion was drawing closer, and in that instant, Elias understood something with unbearable clarity. If they didn't do something immediately, they wouldn't just be victims of the story, they would become part of it. There would be 2 more names, 2 more disappearances, 2 more lives given to the ancient promise. The shadow took another step, slow, deliberate, and behind them, the door through which they had entered began to close. No wind, no hands, no warning. The mansion had made its decision. The test had begun. The door moved slowly, as if obeying its own rhythm, yet leaving no room for choice. The drawn-out creak filled the room with a sound that seemed to crush any possibility of turning back. There was no wind strong enough to push the wood, no draft to justify the movement. Once again, the mansion made it clear it needed no physical excuses to act. The space between the door and the frame shrank, centimeter by centimeter, like a horizon closing. The hallway outside became a gray stripe, then a dark line, then only a memory. The interior of the room gradually assumed the role of entire world. The outside suddenly seemed too far away, almost theoretical. The house was pulling them into its core. The figure in the gloom took another step, no arms raised, no obvious threats. The threat was its very existence, combined with the fact that, as the door closed, doubt vanished. They were being kept here, not as intruders caught in the act, but as chosen guests. The room had taken on the function of a judgment hall. The stone altar, with the open book, became the center of the board. The crack beside it had lengthened, etching a fissure that crawled toward the floor, as if the pedestal itself were under strain. With each new crack, it was as though the mansion reminded them that the old vow still demanded an answer. It was not enough for love to exist. It had to be tested, demanding. Elias felt his entire body vibrate and alert. The adrenaline made his thoughts at once sharper and more scattered. He realized, with painful clarity, that he was not merely facing a supernatural narrative. He was facing a struggle over the meaning of his own life. The book offered one version, that he, Helena, and the feeling between them were nothing more than parts of an ancestral pattern, just another gear in a machine of repetitions. Yet there was a part of him that refused to accept that. That refusal was what the mansion seemed unable to tolerate. The book remained open, and the lines slowly appearing in the lower corner of that blank page continued to form, as though the house were writing in time with their own pulses. There was still no complete name, but the ink advanced, sliding in a silence heavier than any scream. Helena, shaken by the sight of the page, felt something inside her crack along with the stone, realizing that the love she had so long yearned for could be used as fuel for a trap, shook everything she believed about destiny, protection, and faith. For a long time, she had imagined that her anxiety, her fears, her difficulty in fully trusting someone were simply personal traits. Now, she saw that part of that might not be only hers. Perhaps it belonged to the house. Perhaps it was an emotional inheritance that had silently seeped into her formation, shaping even the way she related to love. The mansion seemed to feed exactly on that point. The fear of loving fully, the fear of loss, the urge to control what cannot be controlled, the ancient oath, made in desperation by someone who would not accept separation, had become Pedro Alta's backbone. The jealousy of one heart had spread through the walls, becoming the jealousy of the mansion itself. Anything that threatened to break its logic of possession became a target. Elias, looking at Helena, felt the weight of that understanding. It wasn't only his life that was at risk. It was the possibility that she might never be able to have a love that wasn't filtered through the house's gaze. That caused him a deep pain, a mixture of compassion and indignation. His desire to protect her no longer came only from their bond, but also from a kind of rebellion against the injustice of that legacy. The environment around them seemed to sense the intensification of that inner rebellion. The air grew denser, as if layers of old sighs were suspended there, waiting to be breathed again. With every inhale, it felt as though fragments of old stories were being absorbed. In the corners of the room, smaller shadows moved timidly, like remnants of older presences reacting to the current agitation. The main figure at the back seemed made more of density than of form. It was impossible to clearly define a face, clothes, age. The impression was of a human outline wrapped in overlapping layers of memory, as if several silhouettes had been stacked one atop the other until they became just one. Perhaps, inside it, there echoed traces of whoever had made the original oath, whoever had tried to reverse it, whoever had been lost trying to understand. As fear accumulated, a quiet thought surfaced in both Elias and Helena, though in different ways. What if the test wasn't simply to live or die? What if the test was to choose? What if the house were trying to force them to decide between the love they felt and the safety of leaving each other? It was easy to imagine that, in its twisted logic, the mansion might propose something like this: stay together and face the possibility of tragedy, or separate so the cycle can be fed with yet another loss. The emotional pressure increased, like water rising in a container. Silence ceased to be mere absence of sound and became a compressed space between what was coming and what could no longer be undone. In a nearly imperceptible moment, something changed in the way Helena looked at the book. It was no longer only fear. There was a glint of decision there, born from the exhaustion of feeling like a toy in the hands of other people's memories. The love she felt for Elias, instead of weakening, seemed to condense, becoming denser, clearer. It was not a childish love that romanticizes everything. It was an adult love that sees the risk and chooses anyway. And that choice was what the house tried to manipulate. Elias noticed this change in her eyes and felt something similar grow inside himself. It was like a silent alignment. The two of them, by different inner paths, were reaching the same point. The refusal to be nothing more than the continuation of an old promise. The mansion could be large, heavy, ancient, loaded with memory, but it was still only a setting. What they felt for each other was reality beating there, in that exact moment. That spark of clarity seemed to disturb the room. A louder crack echoed from the fissure in the pedestal, and the tapestries trembled all at once, as if a wind from nowhere had passed straight through the fabric. The figure in the shadows tilted its head slightly, a minimal gesture, but full of meaning. It was as if something there, in that cluster of presences, were evaluating a new possibility, that someone might not only fear, but refuse to play by the same rules. The book responded. The pages, previously still, began to turn on their own, backwards, as if the house had decided to show more. The sheets flipped in sequence, revealing old records, descriptions of nights like this one, when lovers were brought into the emotional center of the mansion's labyrinth. In each account, the same pattern: fear, pressure, forced choice. Some couples separated before the critical point, leaving the house satisfied with a fresh rupture. Others insisted on staying together, and they were remembered there as complete tragedies, deaths wrapped in circumstances that were never fully explained. There was only the idea, recorded in haste, like the last breath of someone who had perhaps tried and failed. That possibility awakened in both of them something the mansion was not used to facing: the courage of those who have lost the fear of losing everything. The house reacted quickly to this deviation in thought. The stone floor vibrated more strongly, and the crack beside the pedestal stretched toward the walls. The mood in the room reached a point where everything seemed possible, from total break to total submission. The love between Elias and Helena was there, breathing, but surrounded by old expectations and by a place that demanded sacrifice as proof of authenticity. The altar trembled softly, and the book upon it responded with tiny spasms, as if the words wanted to leap from the pages. The crack in the pedestal continued to widen, not in a straight line, but in small pulses synchronized with the invisible energy circulating through the room. It was as though the house were losing control for a few moments and, for that very reason, beginning to defend itself more urgently. Helena, consumed by memories flaring up like rekindled embers, felt torn between two forces. On one side, a deep fear of whatever seemed to be emerging from the darkness, a nearly ancestral force that demanded reverence and obedience. On the other, the painful clarity that this presence, the cycle, The book, the ritual did not represent love, but possession. It was a force that tried to disguise itself under the name of protection, when in truth it was control. That recognition did not appear as logical reasoning, but as an internal break, as if a layer of emotional conditioning had dissolved. For the first time, she understood that much of what she had felt throughout her life, fear of trusting, fear of losing, fear of loving, might not be entirely her own. It might be the house's influence, seeping in since childhood, an emotional inheritance molded by generations of women trapped in the same fate. Elias noticed the change in her. It wasn't just panic, it was a quiet clarity, a kind of awakening. He saw her posture shift subtly, as if her mind and body finally aligned, as if Helena stopped being merely someone dragged along by events and became an active participant in what was about to unfold. That change provoked an immediate response from the mansion. The tapestries shook more violently, and the floor released another deep crack. The shadow at the back took 2 steps, and this time it was not hesitation, but advance. Its contour grew sharper. It looked like a tall human figure, but with slightly distorted proportions. There was no visible face, only the suggestion of features. On some level, it felt less like a person and more like an emotion taking shape. Jealousy, perhaps. Pain turned into a guardian. The air grew heavier, harder to breathe, as if the room were gradually sucking the oxygen into the walls. Elias felt the pressure in his chest rise, but instead of backing away, he moved closer to Helena. The mansion interpreted that gesture as a challenge. A brief flash, almost like an electrical spark, ran along the crack in the pedestal, illuminating the edges of the book for an instant. Helena perceived it as a direct sign. A thread of thought, which until then was only a feeling, took clear form in her mind. Her love for Elias was being tested, but not by life or circumstances. It was being tested by the house. The house wanted to prove that no love could survive the jealousy it had harbored since that first ancient oath. And if they gave in to fear, if they doubted each other, if they pulled away, if they hesitated, the cycle would remain intact. On the other hand, to resist meant to face something inhuman, something made of decades, perhaps centuries of accumulated energy. Elias, sensing the same thing, drew closer. Their breaths met, even without words. In that room, the act of being close was more than affection. It was resistance. It was choice. It was a silent attempt to affirm that the bond between them belonged to them, not to the house. That closeness triggered the clearest reaction yet. The book began to emit a very low sound, almost a hum, as if it were vibrating between 2 opposing forces. The page where the name had begun to appear grew more marked, the strokes darker, as though the house were rushing the writing. Afraid of losing control, the figure in the shadows moved again, leaning its body toward them now, as if it sensed it had to intervene before something slipped beyond the mansion's will. The pressure in the air grew so intense that Helena put her hand to her chest, struggling to breathe. Elias took her hand, and in that gesture a clear warning emerged. If they let go, it would be the end. The house seemed to want to separate them by fear, or doubt, or the suffocating weight of the atmosphere itself. It was emotional manipulation using the physical space. The sounds in the walls intensified again. Now it felt as though something were moving behind the stone facing, as if parts of the house were shifting, not like an animal, but as if the structure itself were rearranging its body. It was the unsettling sense of being inside an organism, adapting itself as needed. The tapestries swayed in unison, as if internal gusts of wind crossed the air. The figure took another step, now revealing the outline of its arms. Long, thin, almost translucent, as though made of compressed smoke. Elias squeezed Helena's hand more tightly, realizing the danger was no longer merely psychological, it was beginning to manifest in tangible ways. Then Helena felt something break inside her, not in the form of fear but of understanding. She did not need to fight the house with force, because the house did not operate through physical strength. It reacted to fear, insecurity, jealousy, loss. Its energy was fed by uncontrolled emotion. That was why, for generations, the house had always won. Couples gave in to panic, to doubt, to the suffocating pressures the mansion induced. The only way to stop the cycle would be to break the house's emotional source, not with violence, but with a choice. A choice that went against everything Pedra Alta had learned to expect from its residents. Helena turned her face to Elias and, even without words, conveyed the thought clearly that he did not need to fear losing her, that she was there of her own free will, that her love was not a reflection of the house, but her own decision. That silent, profound thought seemed to trigger an invisible rupture. The figure in the shadows stopped, as if struck by something it did not understand. The book shook more violently, as if its inner energy were coming apart. The crack in the pedestal branched rapidly, forming veins that spread all the way into the floor. And then, for the first time since they had walked in, the house retreated. Not physically, but emotionally. It was a slight, subtle retreat, but real, as if it had been pushed a step back inside its own awareness. Elias sensed it immediately. The pressure in the air lessened for a few seconds, letting them both breathe a little easier. The shadow at the back blurred for an instant, becoming more diffuse, like a smudge. The book, however, did not stop. The ink continued to appear on the blank page, but now irregular, shaky, as if the mansion was struggling against the disruption of the pattern it knew so well. The tension in the room surged again, but now with a different quality. It was no longer pure threat, it was direct conflict. For the first time in decades, the house no longer had full control, and that meant the turning point was about to emerge. A new sound then echoed through the room, not from the walls, nor from the floor, nor from the book. It came from the ceiling, as if something up there was splitting apart. Something big, something structural. The mansion was about to reveal its best-kept secret, and when it did, nothing, absolutely nothing, would remain the same. The sound from the ceiling was not a common noise. It did not resemble the groan of an old beam or the crack of wood under strain. It was deeper, heavier, like something massive sliding slowly, pushing through matter that had long been asleep. The vibration ran through the room in an almost organic way, as if the mansion's heart were changing rhythm. Helena lifted her eyes instinctively, feeling a wave of cold rush down her spine. Elias also looked up, but did not immediately see the source. The ceiling appeared intact, at least to the human eye, but something was moving up there. It was as though a layer behind the wood was shifting, as if the structure itself were rearranging to reveal something hidden. The tapestries swayed again, but this time all of them moved toward the center of the room, as though the air were being drawn upward. The figure in the shadows froze, tilting its face slightly toward the ceiling, just as they had. That was a clear sign. Even the shadow was reacting to something greater. Something that did not come from the ritual, but from the living foundations of the house. The altar shook. The book vibrated so violently that its edges struck the stone, letting out small, dry cracks. The fracture beside the pedestal shot across the floor like lightning, circling Helena's and Ilias's feet as if drawing a boundary. It was as though the house were dividing territory. On one side, the altar, and the shadow. On the other, the couple. In between, the line where everything was about to break. The sound in the ceiling turned into a continuous, deep scraping, as if something were being dragged not just in one dimension, but in two. A dragging that seemed to come from inside the upper walls, running along beams, pushing dust, and digging up memories from heights no one had visited in decades. Then, for the first time, a fragment of something fell from above, not wood, not dust, but a piece of old fabric, tapestry fabric. Yet it didn't match any of the tapestries visible on the walls of the room. It had come from above, which could mean only one thing. There were tapestries hidden between the ceiling and the attic, concealed for generations, perhaps covering something that was never meant to be seen until the cycle was fully awakened. The emotional weight of that struck Helena hard. She felt a sudden urge to remember, as if memories that weren't hers were trying to cross time and surface in her mind. A flash, a vague image of someone walking down a high corridor, carrying a dark cloth that seemed alive, laying it over something too large to be easily described. A voice not exactly human whispering that it must sleep there forever. She raised a hand to her head, feeling the pressure of that memory cut through her like a blade. Elias caught her at once, helping her stay upright. His touch seemed to push back part of the mental invasion, as if the bond between them formed an involuntary shield against the house's emotional force. The figure in the shadows took a step back, a subtle gesture, but a powerful one. It seemed to recognize that something was about to emerge from above that was beyond its control. The shadow was a guardian, but not sovereign. Even it responded to what was coming with respect and fear. And then the ceiling finally began to give, not collapse, give, as if a lid were being carefully removed. The sound became a long, drawn-out groan, resonating inside the walls. Smaller fragments of wood fell like thick dust. The air grew denser, harder to breathe, as if thousands of ancient particles had been released at once. The whole room seemed to slide backward in time, the colors darkening, shadows stretching, the vibrations deepening into something almost ritualistic. Something was being revealed, something that was not part of the usual ritual, something that might be its origin. When an opening finally appeared in the ceiling, it wasn't large, but it was enough to reveal a dark mass. It was not human, not animal, not simply an object. It was more structure, a kind of old wooden arch covered with black fabric that fluttered despite the lack of wind. It looked like a condensed symbol, as if it were the first altar, or the first promise, or the root of whatever had turned Pedra Alta into an emotional organism. The black cloth, apparently fixed to iron and wooden supports, shuddered more intensely. It wasn't just old fabric. It seemed charged with residual energy. The energy of pain, fear, feverish vows. The energy of every love lost there, of every tragedy repeated there. It was like a reservoir of extreme emotion, stored for generations under the roof, hidden so no one would know the house breathed from that point. Helena felt a deep shiver, as though something inside her answered that sight with recognition, not because she had seen it as a child, but because she was part of an emotional lineage bound to everything hanging in that air. Elias, on the other hand, felt anger. Anger at whatever had hidden so many lives. Anger at the symbol that stood for all the losses that should never have happened. Anger at realizing that his love for Helena was considered just more fuel for a dark tradition. That anger, however, had an unexpected effect. The book reacted. Its pages trembled violently. The name that had been forming began to come undone. The ink pulled back as if sucked away. The mansion did not expect that. It did not expect emotional resistance. It did not expect opponents who were not afraid to disobey. The figure in the shadows tilted its head again, this time more deeply. It was an almost human gesture, but one that conveyed surprise, perhaps even confusion. The altar shuddered as if it were about to split in two. The noise in the walls grew harsher. The ceiling quaked as if something even larger was pushing to emerge, pressing against the lower layers of the house, tired of being kept concealed. And then, unexpectedly, the floor around them began to move, not open up, move, as if the house were rearranging its interior space. The ring of cracks lit up for a brief moment with a dull glow, like the reflection of distant fire. The air became both hotter and colder at once. It was as though two energies struggled against each other, the possessive energy of the house and the emotional energy born from the couple's resistance. Helena drew a deep breath, feeling herself poised on the edge between losing and finding herself. The house tried to push into her mind, but her bond with Elias created an unexpectedly powerful barrier. Her thoughts now were crystal clear. The house wanted everyone to believe there was no way out. That understanding echoed inside her like a revelation that came from within, not from outside. And in that moment something crucial happened. The black fabric in the ceiling began to tear, slowly, deeply, inevitably. A line opened like an old wound finally giving way. And from within that tear emerged a strange glow of an undefinable color. Something between aged gold and metallic gray. A glow that seemed to carry memories, as if it were made of fragments of accumulated emotion. The entire mansion shuddered. The deepest secret was waking. The core of the cycle was coming into the light. And the figure in the shadows took one last step, not forward, not in attack, but as witness. The glow seeping through the tear in the black fabric above did not belong to any known light. It was not flame, not electricity, not moon reflection. It was a heavy, almost viscous radiance, as though made of compacted memories. Each flicker of that light seemed to bring echoes of laughter, sobbing, pleas, vows, farewells. The air vibrated in a low tone, as if, for an instant, the entire house breathed at once. Helena's body reacted before her mind did. Her heart raced, her hands went cold, her legs threatened to give out. It wasn't just fear, it was deep recognition. That light, somehow, was part of the bloodline running in her veins, as if all the intense emotions her family had felt over generations, their loves, jealousies, guilt, and losses had been drained and stored there in dense, concentrated form. The mansion didn't just remember, it stockpiled. Elias, staring into the glow, felt something different. He felt anger and compassion tangled together. He realized, with painful clarity, that grotesque luminosity was the result of something originally human, the fear of loss, the despair of someone who loved too much, the impulse to hold on to another person at any cost. At the beginning, all of it might have been nothing more than an act of desperate love, but here, transformed into this concentration of energy, it had become a hungry organism, addicted to repetition. The crack in the ceiling widened, exposing an old metal structure, like a ring wedged among the beams, supporting that fabric and that light. It looked like an inverted crown, installed at the highest point of the house, above everyone, invisible to ordinary eyes. A place where promises had once been spoken in trembling voices and, where silence, afterward, had devoured everything. The surrounding walls responded as if connected directly to that focus. The stones seemed to sweat, exhaling a cold moisture. The floor shivered again, but this time not as threat, but as adjustment. The mansion was quietly redrawing its own insides. The book on the altar began to react to the light. The printed letters on its old pages darkened, as though burning from the inside. The blank page where ink insisted on writing the next fate now seemed locked in combat. Strokes appeared and retreated, as if two forces were writing at once, one trying to inscribe, the other trying to erase. The sheet shook. The figure in the shadows, motionless until then, seemed to swell for a moment, not in height, but in presence. Its outline was still vague, but now it was possible to discern something like a fold of fabric, the slope of bent shoulders, a contrast between darkness and the light pouring from above. That entity was not separate from what was happening, it was part of it. It carried condensed within itself the marks of whoever had once inaugurated the vow that birthed the trap. Helena felt a flash of memory that wasn't exactly hers, a person standing beneath that same spot in the ceiling, before a younger version of the altar, holding the hands of someone they loved, tears in their eyes, an intense love, sincere, true, but stained by a phrase spoken inwardly, that they would rather see everything fall apart than lose that person. A phrase like that, charged with desperate passion, didn't just vanish into the air. The house, sensitive to extremes, had recorded each syllable like hot iron branded into wood. Elias realized that at the root, that energy wasn't purely evil. It was born, at some level, from a distortion of love. And that was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of it. They weren't just fighting against an abstract force, but against something that had once sprung from the same source as what he himself felt for Helena, the urge not to let go. The pain of even imagining her gone. The difference was that now, here, he could choose what to do with that impulse. The house, on the other hand, seemed incapable of imagining a love that did not demand control. The glow above intensified. Small fragments of light began to break off from the crack, drifting down through the air as if they were ashes in reverse. When these fragments touched surfaces, the altar, the floor, the walls, they seemed to dissolve, but left behind a sense of heaviness, as though every point they touched grew denser. When one of them landed on Helena's skin, a storm of emotion ripped through her. In a single instant her mind was flooded with images of relationships that weren't hers, but whose pain felt familiar. Farewells at the mansion gate, tears held back behind shuttered windows, letters torn up before they could be sent, dreams abandoned out of fear. It was as if that glow was made of all the choices shaped by jealousy throughout the house's history. She nearly collapsed, but Elias caught her. In his touch was something that broke the flow of those visions, like a hand from the present interrupting the invasion of the past. Her body relaxed for a moment. The house felt it, and seemed not to like it. The book gave a louder crack. Its cover lifted a few millimeters, as if trying to open again, but it couldn't. There was resistance, pushing back. The old judgment of the mansion and the couple's will were clashing on that very surface. The fracture in the pedestal, now wider, sprouted a small branch that climbed toward the altar, as though trying to reach it. It was a symbolic crack as well, the base of the oath splitting and advancing toward the heart of the pact. The mansion answered with silent convulsions, and the room shook, but did not fall apart. It held the house was willing to endure tremors as long as it could keep the cycle intact. And yet there was something new in the air, the sense that, in that exact moment, it wasn't just the house testing the couple, it was the couple testing the house. The figure in the shadows tilted its head slightly, as if it didn't fully understand what it was seeing. Perhaps it was unused to such persistent resistance. Perhaps, generation after generation, lovers had always yielded before reaching this point. Despite her physical exhaustion, Helena felt a clarity she had never known. She now understood that the mansion's legacy was not only tragedy, but sick attachment. There was something almost childlike in the way that energy clung to promises, terrified of being forgotten. It was a jealousy that could not bear the natural motion of life, meetings, farewells, changes, new beginnings. Elias, in silence, walked his own inner path. He remembered his insecurities from the start of their relationship, the times he feared. Helena would pull away the moments he interpreted her silence as disinterest, when in truth it was the emotional heritage of the house acting through her. He now saw that his jealousy, however human, might also have been manipulated by the mansion. At times, he might not have been entirely the one feeling it, but an amplified echo of something much larger. Recognizing that hurt, but it also freed him. He could choose, right there, to reject that emotional loan. He could choose not to be the continuation of that pattern, and in that silent decision, something inside him shifted. The room's energy reacted as if struck. A brief flash raced along the crack in the floor. The light descending from the ceiling flickered, like a flame hit by sudden wind. The luminous fragments suspended in the air froze for a second, as if awaiting orders. For an instant, the mansion seemed unsure how to respond to such a clear refusal. The next instant was violent. A dull impact echoed through the entire structure, rising from the most remote depths of the house cellars, foundations, buried stone layers. A blow that knocked nothing down, but made everything tremble. It was like the roar of something ancient, not in sound, but in vibration. Helena clutched her chest, feeling a sudden pressure, as if the house were, in one last push, trying to reawaken her fear of loss. Intense images streaked through her mind. Elias falling down a staircase, Elias vanishing into a locked room, Elias being taken by the night with no explanation. Her heart clenched. The house knew exactly where to press, but now she recognized the tactic. She knew this was Pedro Alta's way of bargaining through terror, and with almost superhuman effort, she kept her mind fixed on something simple and real. Memories of small moments with Elias outside the mansion, the ordinary light of ordinary days, walks without the shadow of ancient walls, soft laughter, gentle touch. The way he noticed the smallest things in the world. Those images worked like an anchor. The pressure slowly receded. The house realized that the more it pushed them toward an emotional abyss, the more they sought refuge in each other, and that generated a kind of strength that didn't he know how to feed on. The glow in the ceiling fled again in a defensive surge. The tear in the black fabric widened further, now revealing, beneath the metal arch, the outline of something hanging there. It was no body, no piece of furniture. It was more abstract, perhaps a kind of amulet, perhaps some ritual piece. Its surface reflected the light in fractured ways, as if made of many faces, each holding a fragment of some story. It was clear that the object acted as a condenser. Everything ever sworn, promised, demanded, wept, and feared beneath Pedro Alta's roof converged upon it. The object was the heart of the pact, the core of the trap, the point around which the house had organized its jealousy. Elias and Helena, without needing to speak, reached the same conclusion. If there was any way to break the cycle, it would have to go through that core. But approaching it meant crossing the center of the mansion's territory. It meant walking directly beneath the source of its ancient possessiveness. It meant facing the full reaction of the house, without any disguise. The figure in the shadows, upon sensing that their focus had shifted to the object hanging from the ceiling, moved again, placing itself slightly in front of it, like a barrier or a warning. It didn't feel like a pure enemy. It felt like someone who, at some point, had believed they were protecting something. But what had once been protection had become a prison. The altar vibrated, the book shook, and the blank page continued to fight against the ink trying to fix itself there. The crack in the pedestal finally reached the base of the altar. A small chip broke off and hit the floor, producing a dry, decisive sound, like an exclamation point. Act 2, inside that room, had reached its maximum saturation. There between the torn ceiling, the light of memories, the book of destinies, and the shadow-shaped figure, the romance between Elias and Helena was being compressed to the extreme, not tested by a lack of love, but by an excess of interference. Everything converged toward a choice. Allow the house to write the ending, or, for the first time, write something the house could not predict. The turning point wasn't just structural, nor just supernatural. It was intimate. It was the choice that, even if everything collapsed, the love between them would not be defined by walls, by someone else's promises, or by a mansion that refused to be forgotten. The house felt that, and answered with the thing it knew how to do best. A final adjustment, deep and dangerous, began to form in its innards. And before that next movement could complete itself, the air in the room primed itself for something that would bring the beginning of the end, not just of the cycle, but perhaps of Pedro Alta itself. The sound that began to echo through the mansion-esque guts sounded like none of the ones that came before it. It was not the crack of wood, nor the murmur of walls, nor the soft dragging that once announced invisible presences. It was a deep, uneven sound, layered like something very large was awakening in the underground, pressing against beams, running through inner corridors, and rearranging parts of the house no inhabitant, living or dead, had ever known. The air grew hotter and colder at the same time, creating waves that seemed to pass through Elias's and Helena's chests with different intentions. It was as if the mansion were testing their emotions, drawing them together with warmth and pushing them apart with cold, searching for cracks where it could seep in the shadows of its ancient promise. The glow dripping from the ceiling from the fissure in the black fabric now flickered like a flame at the mercy of a wind that didn't exist. It was a living, pulsing light that seemed to watch as much as it illuminated. The mass suspended above them, that multifaceted object that looked more like an irregular crystal stuffed with memories, now reflected light in unpredictable directions, casting tiny fragments of stories across the walls. Each reflection seemed to hold microscenes, glances, interlaced hands, falls, doors slamming shut, muffled screams. The past was right there, repeating itself to exhaustion, as if trying to prove its authority. The figure in the shadows remained motionless, yet tense. It was as though it were witnessing, with a kind of sorrowful awareness, the final revelation of what the house truly harbored. And in that moment, for the first time, Helena felt empathy for that shadow, not because she stopped fearing it, but because she understood that, somewhere far back in time, that presence had stood on the wrong side of a love that might have been beautiful, but had been contaminated by the obsessive fear of loss. Love that became obsession, obsession that became a promise, promise that became a cycle, cycle that became a prison. The mansion was the monument to that prison. The altar shook again, now with greater intensity. The crack branching out from the pedestal reached the edges of the upper stone. The book shuddered violently, as if struggling against invisible hands trying to force it to remain open. The page where the names had begun to appear was now split down the middle by a new fissure. It was as though the house were trying to write again, and tear more, desperately trying to impose its narrative. Elias felt the urge to rip the book from the altar, to destroy it, to keep it from recording anything else. But he knew, at some instinctive level, that the book was only a tool, not the cause. Burning the pages would not destroy the pact. It might even enrage the house. It might accelerate the tragedies it had been preparing. It was the core suspended in the ceiling, the receptacle of extreme memories that mattered. He understood that with staggering clarity. Helena, in turn, felt the pull of that core, not as seduction, but as confrontation. It was as if the house, sensing their growing resistance, had decided to reveal its greatest weapon, the origin of the cycle. Showing it now was not some generous act of unveiling, it was a threat. It was a way of saying, this is where it began, and this is where it ends. If they dared to touch it, the consequences would be incalculable. The mansion seemed certain the fear of losing each other would stop them from stepping toward the core. That was how it had always won, with fear, fear of loss, fear of death, fear of madness, fear of separation, fear of loving too much, fear of loving too little. But something in both their hearts had changed. It wasn't heroic courage, it was clarity. The house did not love them, did not protect them, had never truly protected anyone. It was just an organism fed by the worst side of human love, the possessive, jealous, controlling, desperate side. The house needed that side to exist. Helena, chest heaving, lifted her face toward the ceiling. The light wrapped around her in a way that was almost unsettling, painting her eyes with golden-gray reflections. It was as if she were staring into the past of her entire bloodline, mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, all of them. In some way, bound to that energy, she felt something tighten inside. Not fear but ancestral grief. The quiet pain of women who had lived and died without understanding the reason for so many missed chances, so many disappearances, so many loves that withered for no apparent reason. The mansion seemed to feed on that pain, and in that instant, Helena decided it would end here. That silent decision triggered an immediate reaction. The glow from the ceiling expanded like a contained explosion. The multifaceted object swayed in its frame, emitting a loud groan like metal being strained to its limit. The figure in the shadows lifted what seemed to be its face, revealing, for the first time, a glimpse of human features deformed by centuries of accumulated emotional pain. Elias felt his heart race not from fear, but from something more primal, adrenaline. He understood, as if sealed by invisible hands, that the moment of choice was only heartbeats away, that fate, theirs, the mansion's, the family lines, was tipping. The house, sensing the imminent break, tried to intervene. The walls shuddered, the floor heaved under their feet. An icy wind blew down from inside the ceiling, dropping like an impossible gust. The tapestries twisted like living organisms, and a crushing pressure filled the room, as though the walls were trying to push them away from the altar, away from the core, away from the truth. Invisible hooks, like ancient fingers, tried to drag them back to the pattern. Fear, hesitation, submission, but now, fear was no longer in charge. Elias took Helena's hand, gripping it with enough strength to cut through the emotional chaos around her, yet without possessiveness. It was a firm, honest touch that said, I'm here, you're not alone, and this isn't the house deciding, it's us. Feeling that touch, Helena's mind cleared as if a curtain had been pulled aside. The house could not control what she felt for Elias. It couldn't manufacture that. It couldn't infect it unless they let it. The bond between them was beyond the reach of the pact, and that weakened the mansion. The pressure in the air faltered. The core in the ceiling wavered. The figure in the shadows flickered like a threatened silhouette. The book struck the altar once like it was fighting to keep its story going, but it was too late. The choice was ripening, and it was a choice Pedro Alta had never conceived of. Not to sacrifice, not to run, not to obey, but to confront. Act 2 was at its limit. The turning point had solidified. The house, realizing it was about to lose control for the first time since its creation, prepared its final gesture, its last attack, its last effort to keep the cycle alive. The floor shook violently. The ceiling opened wider. The core pulsed like a heart on the verge of bursting. The figure advanced. The book tried to write by force. The memory struck, and the entire mansion bent, threatening to collapse, threatening to crush them, threatening to consume everything. And then, in the precise instant of that desperate convergence, something began to crack, not in the house, but inside it. The heart of the mansion, that multifaceted object, let out its first snap, the first warning that the cycle would not survive intact. It wasn't just matter breaking, it was as if a bond too old to be seen with the naked eye were coming apart, fiber by fiber, from within. It was as if a tension line that had been tying him to the mansion from the moment he walked through the gate were beginning to loosen. For a moment, the weight on his chest lifted. Air moved more easily in his lungs. Now, part of that weight shifted, searching for a new place to exist. And reached the deep cellars, where the cold felt older than any human memory. And crumbled into grey dust that spread through the air with no weight, but with meaning. The silhouette flickered, losing for the first time the apparent stability it had always displayed. That revealed something crucial. The entity rising there also depended on the core. It too was a hostage of the pact. It too was trapped in that cycle. The mansion, however, did not surrender at once. Its defense instincts, built over generations, were still active. The floor shook with renewed force. Cracks spread in fan-like lines across the whole room, as if the stone had become a dry surface about to break into slabs. The tapestries on the walls writhed in silent rage, as though trying to tear themselves from their hooks. The book on the altar reacted violently. The cover flew open, pages whipping as if a storm had erupted inside it, and the blank sheet surfaced again, ink trying once more to fix itself there. Letters appeared and vanished, multiplying into unreadable scribbles, as if the house were trying to write every possible ending at once: tragedy, separation, death, madness, but nothing managed to stay. Elias understood, almost instinctively, that this was the moment when the mansion would seek any emotional breach to regain control. The broken pieces would find their way back together. The cycle would rise stronger than before. But there was one crucial difference now. She could see the pattern, and seeing it, she could no longer accept it as truth. The light from the ceiling pulsed again, weaker this time, and with that, something in the space around them shifted. The oppression eased a little. The cold no longer cut as deep. The walls stopped trembling without pause. It was as if the mansion were, for the first time in a very long time, tired of a promise kept by force, of a vigil too long, of a jealousy fed by years and years of pain. That weariness opened a gap, and in that gap it was possible to act. Helena looked at the altar, at the book, at the core, at the shadow. She had the clear sense of standing inside an inverted trial. The house had always believed it was the one judging the lovers, but in that moment, She understood that she could also judge the house, not with vengeance, but with clarity, not with hate, but with refusal. Elias felt the same. The anger in him was not only destructive, it was also a cry for justice against the manipulation of the lives that had come before his. The mansion did not deserve to go on deciding endings. It was a place, not a god. An emotional vault, not a supreme being, and like any container, it could be emptied. The core suspended from the ceiling, after that first crack, revealed something they hadn't noticed at first. There were tiny old fractures on its surface, subtle scars that hinted at earlier attempts to break it. Perhaps someone, long ago, had already tried. Perhaps they had come close. Perhaps they had failed because they were alone, and that was the difference now. Elias and Helena were not alone. The love between them, though wounded, though hurt by the revelations, was mutual and conscious. It wasn't blind passion, it wasn't obsession, it wasn't a childish promise of eternal possession. It was a bond that understood risk, understood loss, understood death, and still chose to stay without imprisoning. It was everything the house had never known how to be, and precisely because of that, it was the only thing capable of facing it. The mansion felt that threat almost physically. The floor sent up a harsher tremor, as if the foundations were protesting. The ceiling dripped light more intensely, trying to restore the pressure. The walls threw back distorted echoes, as if old voices had begun whispering in tongues no one remembered anymore. But there was a crucial detail. The shadow in the back no longer advanced. It was trembling. It was as if, watching the core crack, that entity resented it, as if it stood before something that bound it just as much as it bound everything else. A mute pain crossed the blurred silhouette, as if it had carried, for generations, a weight it had never been able to put down. Helena felt a sudden intuition. Maybe that figure was the solidified memory of that first love who made the fatal promise. Not a ghost of the person exactly, but a concentrated echo of their intention. An involuntary guardian of a pact that, at some point, had also imprisoned him or her. If that were true, then no one in the house was free. Not the living, not the dead, not the walls. Everything there was an attempt to hold on to what, by nature, had always wanted to move. And yet here she and Elias were not only willing to stay together, but also willing to let go of what needed to go, even if that meant tearing down the romantic idea that everything is forever. The next crack came with light. A deeper fissure opened in the suspended core. From it, a sort of silent flash spread through the room, sweeping away the shadows for a second. In that brief flare, the walls stopped looking threatening. They showed, instead, the marks of years of existence. Not monsters, but witnesses. Invisible portraits, erased names, footsteps that had echoed there. Everything was revealed as a sequence of lives trying to love the best they could, failing the way they knew how, falling in the only ways they'd learned. The mansion was not the sole villain. It was also a mirror. But any mirror that mistakes itself for absolute truth needs to be broken. The flash receded. Darkness returned. The weight came back, still strong but less absolute. The house was still resisting. It would not allow itself to fade without demanding something in return. And in that instant, the darkest emotions, the ones that had sustained Pedro Alta, launched one last offensive. Elias felt, like a rising tide, thoughts of loss flooding his mind. He saw, against his will, Helena going away, exhausted, shattered by the weight of the story. He saw himself growing old with the sense that he'd failed to save her, living every day with regret. The mansion showed him those scenarios as if they were inevitable, as if it were saying, "You're going to lose anyway, so why resist?" Helena, at the same time, was attacked by a different kind of image. She saw Elias giving in to exhaustion, giving up on her out of fear of becoming just one more name in a tragic book. She saw his face pulling away, not from lack of love, but from terror, and the house whispered, in sensations, "You are the link. You are the heir. Whoever comes close to you pays the price." These visions were precise blows, designed to create cracks, to separate what was coming together, but precisely because they had already seen the origin of that manipulation, both of them were able to recognize the trick. The fear still hurt, but it no longer fooled them. In their thoughts, they turned not toward what they might lose, but toward what they still had: each other. Here, in this moment, there was no guarantee of a future, no certainty of survival, no promise of perfect endings, but there was presence. And presence in that moment was what most contradicted the mansion, which fed on absences. The suspended core groaned again. Another fragment broke off. The light flickered. The fissures widened. The entire house seemed to scream in silence, like a wounded beast finally realizing it would not be able to keep what it had taken for itself. Act 3, there, began to take shape with clarity. It would be a final confrontation, not just between humans and an old house, but between two ways of understanding love, one that enslaves, and one that frees. The heart of Pedro Alta was cracking, and there was no going back to what it had been before. The next move would decide whether the mansion would collapse inward on itself, or drag down with it, in its fall, everything it still loved. The second crack from the core rang sharper than the first, as if the inner structure held out to the last second, tearing itself apart in stubborn threads. The light hanging above them wavered, expanding like an uncontrolled pulse that surged through the entire room. For a brief moment, everything seemed distorted. The altar taller, the walls closer, the floor tilted. The mansion, in all its mass, seemed to be losing its balance. The fractured spiderwebbing across the floor now formed an irregular pattern that looked almost like a map of broken lines, converging on the altar, branching toward the walls, and returning to the center. Elias had the sense that this was, in some way, the house's own portrait, a network of cracks connected to the heart hanging from the ceiling. If that heart shattered completely, the entire map would fall apart. The organism would cease to be an organism, but the mansion still had weapons. It knew the language of fear better than anything. A sudden wave of darkness rolled through the room. Not physical darkness, but something that, for a second, erased the ability to see any beauty, any possibility, any future. It was as if a veil of despair dropped over them, trying to convince them that none of this was worth the effort, that there was no use fighting what had always been bigger. Elias felt the weight of that darkness seep into his mind like smoke. His thoughts grew heavy. For a moment, all he could see were bad endings. Him and Helena separated, not by choice, but by circumstances. One of them wouldn't survive. The image of death circled him, not as a concrete figure, but as a silent certainty. If they kept going, maybe they wouldn't leave there alive. Helena was hit too. The house, which had known her since childhood, knew exactly which strings to pull. An old feeling, almost childlike, resurfaced. The belief that she was dangerous to anyone who loved her. The idea, planted by years of silences and heart phrases, that there was something wrong about her presence in that mansion. The house showed her twisted scenes, people crying in the halls, locked doors, more than one person looking at her as if she were the center of the problem. But this time, there was one crucial difference. They already knew where that voice came from. They already knew it wasn't God, wasn't fate, wasn't truth. It was the house. It was the echo of a wrong vow. It was a place's jealousy. That awareness didn't erase the weight of the visions, but it gave them context. And context, right then, was power. The shadow in the back seemed to sense the change, its blurred form compressed, as if trying to become more defined, more concrete. In its haziness, something of human features began to appear more clearly, like a smudged face trying to reform. It wasn't a monstrous figure, but a presence marked by exhaustion. It looked like someone who'd spent far too long holding shut a door that should never have been locked. The suspended core groaned. A third crack sliced through the silence. This time, a larger fissure opened, cutting across the object from side to side. Light leaked through that opening like a silent spill, pouring down into the room in a veil. Wherever that light touched, surfaces briefly showed their real age. Stains on the ceiling revealed old leaks. The stone floor, once imposing, revealed wear, grooves, patched sections. Under that glow, the tapestries looked less grand and more sad, as if they'd spent too long witnessing the same drama. Under that light, the mansion stopped being an absolute entity and showed itself as a construction, a place made by human hands, carrying human mistakes, amplified by an energy that never learned how to disperse. It was vulnerable, and vulnerability was everything the cycle had always feared. The book, in response, tried one last maneuver. Letters began to fix themselves again, now faster, more aggressively. Ink seemed to run through the paper fibers like poison, trying to form names, forcing lines of destiny into existence. The page itself trembled under the effort, as if it refused but was being forced. That was the mansion trying to write the story before it unraveled for good. Feeling the urgency of the moment, Elias stepped toward the altar with strides that were no longer hesitant, but decided. The fear hadn't vanished, it had just stopped giving orders. He knew he couldn't simply grab the book and run. The house would follow. The cycle would continue somewhere else, by some other path. He had to strike the bond at its center. He had to reach the core, the piece hanging above their heads that still pulsed. Helena followed his movement with her eyes and knew, with a cutting clarity, that this was the most dangerous point of all. The house, sensing their focus, would do anything to keep them from getting to the core. Anything. The floor confirmed that intuition. A stronger tremor knocked them off balance for a second. The cracks, now so many, began to shed fine dust, showing that some pieces of stone were on the verge of breaking loose. The sound of something heavy falling on another floor echoed in the distance. The mansion felt wounded, and like any wounded organism, it reacted in desperation. The walls released a chorus of muffled sounds, not clear voices, but murmurs, heavy breathing, held back sobs, as if, with its core cracked, the house were letting spill the leftovers of all the emotions it had been storing. It wasn't pure curse being released. There was guilt, regret, longing, anguish, a whole archive of undigested feelings. That emotional avalanche hit Helena hard. For a moment she felt the pull of a paralyzing compassion, pity for the house itself, for its twisted history, for everything that had been lost there. The mansion, sensing it, tried to lean on that feeling like a crutch, wanting to stay alive through the heir's guilt. But there was too much love in her heart for that pity to turn into submission. Her love for Elias, in that instant, did not compete with the house's pain. It rearranged it. The sadness was still there, but it stopped being an anchor. It became context. The priority was clear. No love, no matter how old, justified the imprisonment of so many others. The suspended core swayed, as if it were on the verge of tearing free from the structure that held it to the ceiling. The light around it now pulsed in uneven intervals, like a heart failing. The figure in the shadows opened what looked like the traces of a face, as if witnessing the moment its own purpose in the world was about to be erased. The altar emitted a low, continuous sound, like a hum, as if the stone vibrated from within. The book kept shuddering, insistent on writing, though now the letters came out crooked, crossed, incomplete, like sentences losing their meaning halfway through. Nothing stuck. Fate was leaking away through the sides like water, and then, in a sudden impulse, the movement began. Not the mansion's movement. Theirs. Elias took the first step toward the center of the room, aiming not for the book, but for the spot directly beneath the core. Helena followed without needing any spoken agreement. They were like two different notes converging into the same chord. With each step they took, the house answered with deeper tremors, as if trying to shove them back. But the cracks in the floor and ceiling only deepened. The path to the exact point under the core looked short, but every inch demanded effort. The air was heavier there, like water against the chest. Muscles weighed more, heads throbbed. The mansion concentrated all the resistance it had left on that area, as if it were a reinforced gravity field. But they advanced, not as invincible heroes, but as exhausted people who know that turning back would cost more than going on. When they reached the spot beneath the core, the ceiling's glow fell on them like a merciless spotlight. The light, made of condensed memories, tried to seep into their skin, their eyes, their minds. It showed scenes from other times, other couples, other pacts, as if it wanted to convince them nothing would change, that everything would repeat, that their effort was useless. But every scene that appeared met something the house didn't know how to bypass: discernment. Elias watched those fragmented stories, the man who made the original vow, the heiresses who carried the burden, the lovers who arrived full of hope and were crushed by the pressure. He felt pity, he felt anger, but he didn't feel submission. He didn't see himself as a continuation, he saw himself as an endpoint. Helena, under the same light, saw the bloodline as a long, weary line that, in that instant, reached a curve. It was as if all the women before her were gathered at the edge of her gaze, waiting to see what she would do, not as judges but as those who, for a long time, had wanted to do the same and couldn't. The mansion tried one last trick. It made the floor drop a few inches, not enough to open a hole, but just enough to jolt them, to spark the sudden sense of an imminent fall. He tried, with that, to summon the natural impulse of self-preservation, the fear of dying. If that fear overtook them, it would be enough. They would retreat. The house would survive. But in that moment, both Elias and Helena understood something painfully simple. If they lived the rest of their lives under the house's dominion, even if they physically left, it would still be a slow kind of death, a death of choices, a death of trust, a death of future. Between a quick death in confrontation and a slow death in submission, the love they felt chose something else, to risk living. This time, loud. Final. A line opened from end to end along the surface of the object, like a silent mouth tearing open. Light gushed out, brighter now, not as pressure, but as release, as if whatever had been trapped inside had longed, for ages, to finally be set free. It was no longer a guardian. It was a witness to its own end. Act 3 had reached the heart of the climax. The mansion had spent so long accumulating those remnants of life that, when it finally began releasing them, the world inside seemed flooded with loose memories. They were only echoes, freed from the place that distorted them. As the light touched his shoulders and ran along his skin like a warm thread, Elias had the impression of hearing, far away, an ancient cry turning into silence. It was not debt, it was past. But those of the women who had come before her. She saw in flashes, tired faces, silent dilemmas, sleepless nights, hands that hesitated to break away from the house for fear of being ungrateful to previous generations. She saw the mansion itself treated as a family member, as if it deserved loyalty. The foundations of the house, symbolic and literal, swayed, cracks in the floor and pedestal expanded in crooked veins. The organism that was Pedra Alta fought with everything it had left. The walls vibrated harder, as if breathing in sobs. The murmurs rose in an incomprehensible chorus, louder than before, but also more confused. It no longer sounded like the voice of a cohesive entity, but of many emotions unraveling at once. Without direction, the figure in the shadows, before the cascade of descending light, began to fall apart at the edges. Slowly, the outline that once seemed so solid dissolved into fragments, as if that presence were made of the same material as the suspended core. It wasn't pure defeat. In that dissolution, there was a strange kind of relief, as if something that had kept watch for far too long could finally rest. But the mansion did not yield without one last gesture. The floor suddenly dropped a few centimeters beneath Elias and Helena's feet, not enough to swallow them, but enough to make them feel the abyss opening just beneath their skin. A dry sound came from the foundations, echoing like a crack in time itself. The ceiling groaned, announcing the real possibility of collapse. This was no longer metaphor. The house was putting its own structure at stake. This was Pedra Alta's final pact. If the cycle was broken, the price might be the house's own physical destruction. The walls might fall on them. No one might leave alive to tell the story. It was the final attempt at negotiation. Keep me as I am and remain my captives, or erase me and accept the fall. For a moment far too long, that possibility cut through them both like sharp wind. Elias faced, in thought, the idea of dying there, not out of lack of desire to live, but out of understanding that continuing as things were would be a death in chapters. The house would grant them no future that didn't pass through fear, and life, lived in constant fear, would no longer be life. Helena, in turn, felt the same question echo inside her. What did it mean to survive? To stay with Elias, but always under something that watched them, or to allow everything to go to the end and, perhaps in exchange, let whatever came after finally be free, even if fragmented, even if rebuilt without Pedra Alta? The answer did not come in words, but in the shape of the love still pulsing between them. It wasn't love that promised eternity. It wasn't love that swore absolute exclusivity. It wasn't love that required possession. It was love that accepted its own fragility. And that was the kind of love the mansion could not understand, and therefore could not control. The light leaking from the core intensified once more, as if responding to what was growing between them. The fragments of glow seemed to align for a moment, forming a sort of current connecting Helena, Elias, the altar, and the ceiling itself. There was no formal ritual, but there was a silent agreement. From now on, no promise made under that roof would hold more power than the choice of the living. The core cracked one last time, It wasn't the sound of a fall, nor an explosion. It was the sound of something finally allowing itself to break apart. The multifaceted structure, suspended under the metallic arch, shattered into dozens of smaller pieces that spread through the air like luminous dust. The light, now free, ceased concentrating in one point and scattered across the room, without order, without focus. It stopped being a heart. It became diffuse brightness, as if the house had been pierced by an internal flare that erased the illusion of absolute power. As the radiance began to fade, the mansion seemed to exhale one final sigh. The floor stopped trembling. The walls silenced their murmurs. The tapestries, still hanging, sagged like ordinary fabric, heavy and still. The book on the altar closed on its own, but this time without violence. The figure in the shadows vanished completely, as if erased from the house's own memory. Where once there had been a vague silhouette, now there was only ordinary shadow, produced by the dim light still wandering through the room. No trace of presence, only the faint sense that something ancient had finally been released from the obligation to keep watch. The silence that followed no longer had the suffocating weight from before. It was a different kind of silence, the kind that resembles very early mornings, when nothing has begun yet but everything is about to happen. Elias and Helena breathed at the same time, as if synchronizing for the first time since entering the mansion. The air felt less dense, though still carrying the scent of stone, iron, and dust. The house was now simply a house, but that did not mean immediate safety. The structure, shaken by the rupture of the core, began revealing its true age. Cracks in the ceiling corners widened. Chunks of plaster fell in small blocks. A hollow sound, coming from some beam above, revealed that stability was no longer guaranteed. The emotional pact had broken, and the physical body of the mansion reacted, as if it had always been sustained by that same energy. Still stunned, Elias realized that if they stayed, trying to decipher everything, they might not get a second chance. Ending the cycle required not only courage to confront the past, but also the simple act of leaving, crossing the door, abandoning the walls, accepting that the mansion would not be carried with them, not in pieces, not as a relic. Helena understood the same, though with heavier emotion. The place had been part of her family's history for generations. There were photos, objects, fragments of life scattered through every room. Leaving meant accepting a kind of mourning, not only of the house, but of what it had represented, the illusion that everything could be contained, kept, controlled. Even so, staying meant going mad beneath ruins. They needed to leave behind what had long been confused with identity. The steps toward the door now felt longer than when they arrived. The walls, stripped of their oppressive presence, revealed wear, damp stains, marks of old repairs. The house showed itself for what it always had been, a stage, never a deity, never an ultimate judge. Just a container that, for far too long, had been allowed to rule. When the hidden door between the shelves opened again, this time by their hands, not the house's, a fresh breeze entered the room. It wasn't strong wind, just a gentle current from somewhere the mansion still connected with the outside world. The hallway outside seemed brighter, even though no new light had been lit. It was the impression that the darkness, once concentrated, had broken into smaller pieces, incapable of acting as before. Their return through the corridors felt like a silent rite. Each step echoed on the wood, but the echo no longer sounded like a warning. It sounded like farewell. The portrait of Helena's great-grandmother in the main room looked different under this new gaze. The eyes were still deep, the expression still carried melancholy, but there was no threat there. Perhaps there never had been. Perhaps the painting had been only a mirror the mansion used to project its accumulated weight. Passing by it, Helena felt something loosen inside her. Not a blood tie, not a demand for continuity, only respectful recognition. Lives had been lived there, as people could, with mistakes, fears, attempts. There was no glory in preserving suffering in the name of tradition. There was dignity in allowing it to end. The mansion's front door awaited them at the end of the entry hall. The heavy wood still creaked, but now the sound felt ordinary, without hidden meanings. Elias pushed it open with effort, feeling the weight of years, not of a curse. When the gap widened and the grey light from outside flooded in, the mansion seemed smaller under the clarity, less imposing, older. The outside air carried the smell of earth, leaves, and natural dampness. And mixed with it was something subtle the house had always blocked. Possibility. The possibility of continuing their story elsewhere, under another roof, without invisible eyes in the walls. Crossing the threshold felt like removing a heavy coat worn for so long it seemed like skin. The mansion remained behind them, still standing, but silent. It might remain upright for years. It might lose beams, windows, balconies. It didn't matter. What made it a trap was no longer there. The distance to the iron gate seemed to both stretch and shrink. Each step brought them closer to the ordinary world and farther from the epicenter of that story. When the gate finally opened, the metallic sound felt like a definitive cut, as if an invisible blade had separated two eras. The era of the house that lived too much, and the era of the house that was once again just a thing. The world outside did not celebrate. There was no clear sky, no radiant sun, no dramatic arc. The sky was still overcast, the afternoon undecided, but there was a calm that did not depend on spectacle. They had no idea how much time had passed inside. Hours felt rewritten, compressed, stretched. Real-world time outside had moved on, indifferent, and in a way that was comforting. The universe had not stopped to witness two hearts fighting an old house, but for them, everything had changed. By the roadside leading away from Pedra Alta, the feeling was not loud victory. It was exhaustion, a kind of tiredness that held both relief and mourning. Something had broken forever. Something had been saved, but not without cost. The trap had not claimed them, but it had almost. The jealousy that at first seemed merely discomfort, passing insecurity, revealed itself to be a central piece of a deadly mechanism. Human jealousy amplified by walls, by promise, by the fear of being alone. Jealousy turned into structure, ceiling, door, book, shadow. Jealousy that demanded sacrifices and accepted no middle ground. They had crossed all of it with the only antidote the mansion couldn't consume, a love that, vulnerable, refused to become possession. In the days that followed, the memory of that night did not fade. It did not turn into distant dream or into an easy story to tell. It settled in both of them like a mark. Elias, at times, still felt echoes of the house when he closed his eyes, corridors too long, sounds from walls, reflections carrying other eras. Helena carried the weight of knowing she had broken something that had lasted generations. Sometimes that came as quiet pride, sometimes as silent guilt. But with each new day lived away from Pedra Alta, something rearranged itself. They realized that love outside the mansion had a different quality. Still intense, but not pressured. Still deep, but not surrounded by invisible threats. There was room for silence that didn't mean abandonment. Room for fear that wasn't a weapon. Room for doubt that didn't become prophecy of tragedy. Jealousy, such a human feeling, still appeared now and then, as it does in any sincere relationship made of flesh, memory, and fragility. But now they recognized it as part of themselves, not as the voice of walls. They learned to see it not as command, but as sin, an invitation to talk, adjust, care, and they no longer mistook it for supernatural warning. The mansion eventually became just a distant line in the horizon of memory. Some said it still stood. Others claimed it partially collapsed during a stormy night. It didn't matter. What once made it more than stone and wood had been undone. The book, if still inside, collecting dust on the cracked altar, wrote nothing on its own. If someone found it one day, they might read it as curiosity, as the record of a family haunted by its own fears. They might not understand everything. They might assume it was legend. But the letters, even if legible, would no longer carry the same weight. The heart that made them act was gone. And somewhere in a layer of reality not mapped by blueprints or geography, whatever remained of the shadowed figure, the guardian of the pact, rested. Not as banished threat, but as part of an energy that had finally learned to dissolve. The cycle had ended, not with flamboyant heroism or perfect endings. It ended with a quiet decision made by two exhausted human beings, to no longer accept a love that required being proven at the cost of their own lives. Not every shadow is a warning from beyond. But a trap only works while no one sees it fully. And by doing so, they freed not only themselves, but everything that had been used for generations to imprison. The love remained, and destiny finally became an open road instead of a narrow corridor inside a house that wanted to decide everything alone.